I am Rebecca, 33 years old, and for my entire life, my family treated me like a ghost, haunting their perfect portrait. During Christmas dinners, my parents would boast about my younger sister's multi-million-dollar deals, then turn to me with thinly veiled disgust, asking if I was still just teaching online. Tonight was my mother's grand retirement party at the Plaza Hotel in New York. In front of 150 elite guests, my father raised his glass and toasted my sister as the sole heir to the family legacy, openly calling me nothing but a lowly supporter. They thought they had finally put me in my place. They were wrong. Minutes later, my husband, the man they mocked as a struggling database manager, walked straight to the stage, took the microphone from my father's shaking hand, and slowly asked the room, "Do you people even know who your daughter really is?" Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel was dripping in gold and crystal. It was the kind of extravagant, uncompromising venue that my mother Patricia demanded for her 60th birthday and official retirement celebration. After 30 years of ruthlessly clawing her way to the position of regional director at Vanguard Trust, she wanted everyone in New York high society to witness her crowning achievement. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated through the crowd with silver trays of imported champagne, while a string quartet played soft classical music in the corner. The massive room smelled of expensive designer perfume, roasted truffles, and the distinct suffocating scent of old money. My husband Nathaniel and I had been invited, but we were absolutely not welcomed. When we arrived, the hostess did not lead us to the main family table situated prominently near the stage. Instead, she guided us to a small, poorly lit round table tucked away in the very back corner, dangerously close to the kitchen swinging doors. We were seated alongside the catering interns, the coat check staff, and a few junior office assistants who looked terrified to even breathe. It was a deliberate, highly calculated move by my mother to show me exactly where I stood in her grand hierarchy. I wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress I had bought off the rack several years ago. It was clean and perfectly appropriate for the occasion, but next to the sea of custom designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, it marked me as a glaring outsider. Nathaniel wore his standard gray suit, his posture relaxed despite the obvious slight of our humiliating seating arrangement. He reached under the table and gave my hand a firm, reassuring squeeze. His quiet confidence was the only thing keeping my heart from racing out of my chest. For the first hour, we sat in silence and watched the spectacle unfold from the shadows. My mother held court at the center table, laughing loudly and accepting expensive gifts from wealthy clients and banking partners. My younger sister Melissa, 30 years old and newly promoted to a senior legal role at the same firm, stood by my mother's side like a loyal, vicious guard dog. Melissa wore a custom silk gown that probably cost more than my first car, her neck heavy with glittering diamonds. Her husband Gavin, a loud and incredibly arrogant investment fund manager, was busy aggressively handing out business cards to anyone who made eye contact with him. I tried to focus on eating my salad deliberately, ignoring the pitying glances from the waitstaff who were forced to share our table. Then the crowd parted, and my mother walked straight toward our dark corner. She held a crystal glass of deep red vintage wine swaying slightly as she approached. Her eyes locked onto mine, burning with the familiar, suffocating contempt she had directed at me since childhood. The lively conversations nearby died down as guests noticed her purposeful movement. In my mother's world, every action was a theatrical performance designed to establish dominance. She stopped right behind my chair. I did not stand up to greet her. I simply turned my head to look at her calmly. Patricia smiled, a tight, artificial expression that did not reach her cold eyes. She leaned in close, pretending for the audience that she was going to whisper something maternal and loving. Instead, with a swift, deliberate flick of her wrist, she tilted her crystal glass. The dark red liquid poured out in a rush, splashing directly onto the shoulder of my dress and pooling down the front of the light fabric. The shockingly cold wine seeped into my skin, instantly ruining the garment. "Oh my goodness!" Patricia gasped loudly, making absolutely sure the wealthy guests at the adjacent tables heard her theatrical distress. How incredibly clumsy of me. I am so sorry, Rebecca. Though looking closely at that cheap material, I suppose the wine might actually improve the color. Did you order that little dress online? I truly hope the poor fabric does not bleed onto the hotel carpet. The plaza management is very particular about permanent stains. A few wealthy guests standing nearby chuckled behind their hands. My sister Melissa, who had followed closely behind our mother, let out a sharp mocking laugh that cut through the background music. I sat perfectly still, feeling the damp, ruined fabric clinging uncomfortably to my chest. I did not cry. I did not shout or cause a scene. I just looked directly up at the woman who gave birth to me, watching her bask in the cruel, venomous joy of my public humiliation. She wanted a reaction. She desperately wanted me to run out of the ballroom in tears, cementing my role as the weak, pathetic failure of the family. Nathaniel grabbed a thick cloth napkin from the table and began gently dabbing at the ruined bodice of my dress. His face was a mask of absolute calm, though I felt the rigid, dangerous tension locked in his jaw. Patricia looked down at him with undisguised disgust. "Do not bother rubbing it, Nathaniel," she sneered, her voice dripping with poison. "You cannot fix cheap things. You of all people should know that by now. Just sit quietly and enjoy the free food. It is probably the best meal you two will eat all year." With that final insult, she turned on her heel and glided back toward the bright spotlight of the main floor, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and ringing laughter in her wake. I took a slow, deep breath, refusing to let my hands shake. The night was only just beginning, and I knew the real tests were still to come. The lavish dinner service eventually concluded, and the fine china plates were cleared away by the rushing catering staff. The formal speeches were rapidly approaching, and the atmosphere in the grand ballroom grew more celebratory and loud. I remained seated at my dark corner table, the wine stain drying into an ugly, stiff, dark patch on my chest. I kept my posture perfectly straight. I refused to slouch, refused to hide my face. Nathaniel kept his hand resting warmly on my knee, a silent, unmovable anchor in a room full of circling sharks. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors of the kitchen swung open, and the general manager of the hotel walked out, holding a premium leather folio. He looked hesitant, glancing nervously toward my mother's table at the front. Patricia caught his eye immediately and pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly toward the back corner where we sat. The manager frowned slightly, but obeyed the unspoken command of his wealthiest client. He walked past the billionaires, the bank executives, and the local politicians, stopping right beside my chair. He placed the heavy leather folio on the table directly in front of me. I looked at him in genuine confusion. Before I could even ask what it was, Melissa materialized out of the thick crowd. She stepped up to our small table, her arms crossed arrogantly over her chest, a triumphant, wicked smile plastered across her face. "Go ahead, open it," Melissa commanded, her voice raised loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding high society tables. I reached out and flipped open the leather cover. Inside was the detailed, itemized receipt for the entire retirement party. It listed the 5-course gourmet food, the dozens of bottles of imported champagne, the massive floral arrangements, the string quartet, and the exorbitant venue rental fee. At the very bottom of the long receipt, printed in bold black ink, was the final total amount, $45,000. I stared at the massive number, my face remaining completely blank. I slowly looked up at my younger sister. "What is this exactly?" I asked, evenly refusing to let her see any panic. "That is the bill for tonight," Melissa said, practically shouting now so the audience would not miss a single word. "Mom and Dad decided that since they generously paid for your existence for 18 years, it is about time you paid them back. Consider this your required contribution to the family. You have been a useless leech your entire life. It is finally time to settle your debts." The wealthy guests at the nearby tables stopped talking entirely. They were watching us like animals trapped in a zoo exhibit. I could feel their judging eyes, their silent, cruel calculations. Here was the successful, gorgeous Vanguard legal executive demanding payment from her shabby, wine-stained, embarrassing older sister. Melissa leaned heavily over the table, placing her manicured hands flat on the white tablecloth to intimidate me. You work as an online tutor, right? Doing what exactly? Helping slow middle schoolers with basic math. Maybe you have a few pennies saved up in a jar somewhere in your tiny apartment. Why do not you just hand over your debit card right now? Or wait, let us be realistic. Does your sad little bank card even have a limit that high? If you cannot afford $45,000 today, I can call the hotel manager over and see if he will graciously let you wash dishes in the back kitchen for the next decade to pay it off. Her unhinged cruelty was not born out of nowhere. It was carefully cultivated by years of my parents constantly praising her every move while systematically tearing me down. She had learned at a very young age that the easiest way to earn our parents' love and secure her inheritance was to step directly on my neck. I am not paying for a luxury party I did not host, Melissa. I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the intense anger boiling in my veins. You and Mom organized this massive event. The bill belongs entirely to you. Melissa scoffed loudly, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. You have some absolute nerve acting so entitled right now. Mom and Dad housed you, fed you, and put up with your absolute lack of ambition for years. You stubbornly refused to join the family firm. You refused to make anything of yourself. You are a walking embarrassment to the family name. The very least you can do is pay the catering bill. But we all know the pathetic truth. You are completely broke. You cannot even afford to buy yourself a decent dress for a formal event, let alone pay for a luxury dinner. She reached out and tapped the leather folio aggressively with her fingernails. You are pathetic, Rebecca. Just a pathetic, useless tutor married to a useless nobody. I reached out to push the leather folio away, fully prepared to stand up, grab my purse, and walk out of the ballroom. I did not need to subject myself to this theatrical circus any longer. But before my fingers could touch the leather cover, Nathaniel moved. He slid his hand over mine, stopping me gently. He did not look angry. In fact, he looked incredibly relaxed, almost deeply amused by the situation. He calmly picked up the leather folio, glanced at the $45,000 total without blinking, and closed it with a soft, definitive snap. Melissa sneered at him, shifting her venom to a new target. What is wrong, Nathaniel? Are you going to heroically empty your little checking account to save your poor wife? I hear low-level database managers make just enough to pay rent on time. Do you want me to spot you a few thousand so you do not embarrass yourselves further? Nathaniel smiled. It was a cold, sharp, calculating smile that I had only seen a few times during our marriage, usually when he was reviewing highly classified files late at night in his home office. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He did not pull out a credit card or a checkbook to pay the ridiculous ransom. Instead, he pulled out a small, crumpled piece of white paper. He flattened it out deliberately on the table, taking his absolute time, making sure Melissa was watching his every single move. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the piece of paper onto the tablecloth, right next to the $45,000 bill. What is that supposed to be? Garbage, Melissa demanded, glaring at the small slip of paper. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. Why do not you take a closer look, Melissa? He suggested, his voice projecting clearly and carrying over the quiet murmurs of the gathered crowd. Gavin, who had been hovering a few feet away, enjoying his wife's cruel show, stepped up beside her. He looked down at the small piece of paper. His arrogant face instantly drained of all color. He looked exactly like a man who had just seen a ghost walk through the wall. That is a printed receipt, Nathaniel said loudly, making sure the wealthy investors and executives around us could hear every single syllable. A receipt from a cheap gas station in New Jersey, dated exactly 3 weeks ago. Your highly successful husband Gavin called me in a blind panic at 2 in the morning. His luxury SUV was completely out of gas on the highway, and every single one of his platinum credit cards had been declined for insufficient funds. He literally begged me to wire him $200 immediately so he could get home without calling a tow truck. The silence in the massive ballroom was absolute and deafening. Even the string quartet seemed to have stopped playing their instruments in shock. Nathaniel kept his eyes locked firmly on Melissa's pale face. So before you stand there in your custom gown, demanding $45,000 from my wife, you might want to turn around and ask your hotshot investment manager husband why he had to beg a useless database manager for basic gas money. It seems your glamorous, perfect lifestyle is built entirely on maxed out credit limits and empty bank accounts. If anyone in this room is a leech, Melissa, it is the man standing right next to you. Melissa whipped her head around to stare at Gavin in pure horror. Her eyes were wide with shock and betrayal. Gavin, is this true? She hissed through her teeth. Tell me right now that he is lying. Gavin was sweating profusely under the chandelier lights. He tugged nervously at his tight collar, looking around at the elite banking executives who were now staring at him with deep critical suspicion. A fund manager whose personal credit cards were bouncing was a massive career-ending red flag in their cutthroat industry. It was a simple bank error. Gavin stammered, his voice cracking noticeably. A security freeze on the account. I just needed a quick favor until the morning. $200? Gavin. Nathaniel interrupted, his tone laced with heavy mocking. You cried and begged me for $200 and promised to pay me back the very next day. I am actually still waiting for that transfer to clear, by the way. But please feel free to tell us more about how completely broke we are. Gavin's face turned a violent shade of purple with uncontrollable rage. He slammed his heavy fist down on our small table, making the water glasses rattle dangerously. You arrogant, poor piece of trash! Gavin roared, completely losing his corporate composure in front of his peers. How dare you speak to me like that? You are nothing. You are an absolute nobody. I manage millions of dollars for a living. I will have you physically thrown out of here, security. Get these freeloaders out of this hotel right now. Two large, imposing security guards in dark suits immediately started moving quickly toward our table from the main doors. The wealthy guests parted ways rapidly, eager to distance themselves from the screaming match and the impending physical removal. Melissa looked utterly mortified, trying desperately to pull Gavin back by his suit sleeve, but he was far too furious and humiliated to care about social appearances anymore. Get them out! Gavin continued to shout at the top of his lungs, pointing a shaking finger at Nathaniel. They do not belong in this room. I sat perfectly still, the cold wine-stained dress clinging tightly to my skin. I did not feel humiliated anymore. I felt the absolute intoxicating thrill of the trap finally snapping shut. My corrupt family thought they had cornered the weak, helpless daughter. They had absolutely no idea they had just declared war on a woman who held the power to destroy their entire world, and a husband who was more than ready to execute the final sentence. The security guards reached our table, their hands outstretched to grab Nathaniel's shoulders and drag him away. But Nathaniel did not flinch, and he did not stand up to fight. He just sat there waiting patiently for the real show to begin. The heavy hands of the security guards hovered mere inches from my husband's shoulders. Gavin wore a twisted, victorious sneer, fully expecting to see us violently dragged out through the kitchen service doors like discarded trash. But before the guards could make physical contact, a sharp, piercing whine of microphone feedback sliced through the heavy air of the grand ballroom. The jarring noise forced everyone to wince and turn their attention toward the brightly lit stage at the front of the room. My father, Richard, stood behind the crystal podium. He tapped the microphone twice, his expression hardening as he looked past the sea of wealthy guests and locked his cold, calculating eyes directly onto our dark corner. Hold on, gentlemen! My father's voice boomed through the massive speakers, halting the security guards in their tracks. Let us not ruin the elegant atmosphere of this evening with a scuffle. We have far more important business to conduct. The trash can be taken out after the announcements are concluded. Gavin crossed his arms and stepped back, looking intensely satisfied with that arrangement. The security guards crossed their hands in front of them, standing right behind our chairs, like prison wardens, ensuring we could not escape the public execution my father was about to deliver. My father smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo, projecting the image of a powerful, benevolent patriarch. But I knew the man behind the expensive fabric. Richard worshipped at the altar of wealth and status. To him, children were not human beings to be loved or nurtured. We were simply investments. If you yielded a high social return, you were celebrated. If you chose a different path, you were a liability to be aggressively written off. Tonight we gather to celebrate a titan of industry. My father began gesturing warmly toward my mother, who dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief from her front row seat. Patricia has dedicated 3 decades to Vanguard Trust. She clawed her way to the top of a brutal, unforgiving industry, transforming her regional branch into an absolute powerhouse of wealth generation. She is a wolf in the corporate world, and she built a kingdom that demands fierce, uncompromising leadership to maintain. The ballroom erupted into enthusiastic applause. Men in $1,000 suits nodded in solemn agreement. My father waited for the clapping to die down, soaking in the admiration of the elite crowd. He loved holding court. He loved the sound of his own voice dictating the reality of everyone around him. But a kingdom cannot survive without a worthy heir. My father continued, his voice dropping into a dramatic, serious cadence. When Patricia decided it was time to step down, we knew the Vanguard legacy needed to remain in the hands of someone who shared our exact bloodline, our exact drive, and our exact ruthless hunger for success. We needed another wolf. He extended his arm toward the side of the stage. Melissa glided up the carpeted stairs, the stage lights catching the heavy diamonds around her neck. She stood beside our father, radiating arrogance and manufactured grace. I am incredibly proud to officially announce that the board has approved Melissa as the new regional director of Vanguard Trust, my father proclaimed. The crowd cheered loudly, raising their champagne flutes. Gavin clapped harder than anyone, his earlier humiliation temporarily masked by the blinding spotlight shining on his wife. Melissa is the embodiment of our family values. My father praised, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. She is sharp, she is relentless, and she understands that in this family success is not a suggestion. It is an absolute requirement. Then the warmth vanished from his face. The practiced, charming smile dissolved into a flat, unforgiving line. He looked away from Melissa and stared directly over the heads of the elite guests, aiming his next words like a loaded weapon straight at me. Unfortunately, success is not a trait shared equally among offspring. My father said, his voice dropping to a harsh, resonant pitch that echoed off the high ceilings. In the corporate world, you learn very quickly that you cannot carry dead weight. You have to cut your losses to protect the bottom line. It is a harsh reality, but a necessary one. The room grew incredibly quiet. 150 powerful people turned in their chairs, twisting their necks to look at the wine-stained woman sitting in the back corner, surrounded by security guards. They watched with morbid, breathless fascination. For years, Patricia and I tried to mold our eldest daughter into someone worthy of the family name. My father continued, his words slicing through the silence. We offered her opportunities at the firm. We offered to fund a respectable business degree. We offered her every advantage a privileged upbringing could provide. And how did she repay us? She rejected it all to become a glorified online tutor. She chose to surround herself with mediocrity. She chose to marry mediocrity. A few low, cruel chuckles rippled through the tables near the front. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my chin raised, refusing to break eye contact with the man trying to destroy me. Nathaniel sat perfectly still beside me, his breathing slow and measured, analyzing the room like a predator studying its prey. "You see," my father lectured, leaning into the microphone. "There are 2 types of people in this world. There are leaders, the wolves who shape the economy and drive the world forward. And then there are the supporters, the weak, complacent individuals who exist merely to serve the ambitions of their betters. Rebecca, you made it abundantly clear a long time ago that you are merely a supporter, not a leader." He paused, letting the devastating insult sink into the minds of everyone present. He was fundamentally stripping away my dignity, reducing my entire existence to a pathetic cautionary tale for the amusement of his wealthy friends. "Because of your persistent refusal to elevate yourself," my father announced, his voice booming with finality, "Patricia and I have restructured the family estate. I am stating this publicly today so there is absolutely no confusion going forward. Rebecca, you are officially and permanently removed from the family trust fund. Every asset, every property, and every corporate share will be transferred exclusively to Melissa." He gripped the edges of the crystal podium, leaning forward to deliver the final crushing blow. We built this empire with our blood and sweat. We do not fund mediocrity. We do not reward failure. From this moment on, you are cut off entirely. You will not see a single dime of our money. You chose your unremarkable, pathetic life. Now you can live with the consequences of it. The ballroom erupted into applause, once again louder and more enthusiastic than before. They were clapping for my disinheritance. They were cheering for a father who had just publicly executed his own daughter's future. Melissa stood on the stage, her chest puffed out, beaming with an ugly, triumphant pride. She had finally won. She had taken everything, and I was left with nothing but a ruined dress and the mocking laughter of strangers. The security guards standing behind me shifted their weight clearly, waiting for the signal to drag the disgraced, disinherited daughter out into the alley. My father looked at me from the stage, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He thought he had completely broken me. He thought he had delivered the ultimate punishment, but he had no idea that his arrogant public confession was exactly what we needed. He had just confirmed his blind allegiance to a corrupt empire on a microphone in front of 150 witnesses. He had just proudly declared his total alignment with a company that was about to be raided by federal agents. I did not cry. I did not hang my head in shame. I turned my head slightly and looked at Nathaniel. The quiet, unassuming database manager offered me a slow, predatory smile. The stage was finally set. The villains had proudly announced their crimes. It was time to burn their kingdom to the ground. My father stepped back from the crystal podium, wiping away a non-existent tear of exhaustion. The audience applauded his supposed bravery for cutting off his toxic daughter. But the theatrical performance was far from over. My mother, Patricia, stood up from her front row seat. She smoothed down her custom silk gown, taking a deep, shuddering breath that amplified her role as the tragic, long-suffering matriarch. She climbed the short steps to the stage, accepting the microphone from my father with trembling hands. The ballroom hushed immediately, completely captivated by the tearful display. "Thank you, Richard." My mother began, her voice cracking with perfectly practiced emotion. She looked out over the sea of wealthy executives, investors, and socialites. "You all know me as the regional director of Vanguard Trust. You know the late nights, the brutal negotiations, the relentless dedication it took to build this branch into the financial powerhouse it is today. But what you do not know is the hidden personal agony that drove me to work myself to the absolute breaking point." She pointed a trembling diamond-adorned finger directly at our dark corner table. The stage lights seemed to shift, casting a glaring, unforgiving beam right onto my wine-stained dress. "I built this empire for my children," Patricia cried out, actual tears now spilling over her heavily mascaraed eyelashes. "I wanted to hand the reins over to my eldest daughter. I begged Rebecca to join the firm to help her aging mother carry the crushing weight of this legacy. And how did she respond? She turned her back on us. She told me my life's work was meaningless. She chose to sit in a tiny, cramped apartment doing the bare minimum as an online tutor, completely content to let me work myself into the ground." Melissa stepped closer to our mother, wrapping a highly visible, supportive arm around her shoulders and glaring at me with self-righteous fury. Patricia leaned heavily into the embrace, playing the frail victim to perfection. "If it were not for Melissa," my mother sobbed openly, "now I would have collapsed years ago." Melissa stepped up when her sister completely abandoned us. Melissa worked the 80-hour weeks. Melissa carried the massive corporate burden that Rebecca was too lazy and too selfish to shoulder. I am retiring today not because I want to, but because my health has been utterly destroyed by the stress of carrying my eldest daughter's neglected responsibilities. The reaction from the ballroom was instantaneous and visceral. The polite, hushed whispers of the elite crowd transformed into loud, open hostility. These were people who valued hard work, corporate legacy, and absolute family loyalty above all else. My mother had just masterfully painted me as the ultimate traitor to their entire way of life. A wealthy hedge fund manager sitting at a nearby table turned fully around in his velvet chair to glare at me with unfiltered disgust. "What an absolutely ungrateful brat," a woman draped in expensive pearls loudly whispered to her husband, ensuring her harsh voice carried directly to my table. Imagine forcing your own mother to work herself into an early retirement because you are too lazy to get a real job. It is repulsive. Another senior executive chimed in, shaking his head in sheer contempt. It is sickening. Look at her sitting there staring blankly. She does not even look sorry. She looks like she belongs in a gutter, not sitting at a table in the Plaza Hotel. Gavin, sensing the massive shift in the room, moved closer to our table. The security guard still loomed right behind us, but Gavin now felt entirely emboldened by the ballroom's collective hatred. You hear that Rebecca, Gavin taunted, his voice dripping with venomous joy. The whole room knows exactly what you are now, a parasite. You drained your parents dry, you offered nothing in return, and now you have the absolute nerve to show up here and eat their food while they expose your pathetic existence to the world. I sat perfectly still, listening to the heavy wave of condemnation crashing over me from every direction. The irony was so incredibly sharp it almost made me laugh out loud. My mother was standing on that brightly lit stage, crying about being overworked and completely exhausted by her duties. The reality was that I had spent the last 7 years working 100-hour weeks, sleeping on the cold floor of a rented office space, and building a multi-million-dollar corporate forensics firm entirely from scratch. Meanwhile, Patricia's brutal 80-hour weeks consisted of arranging illegal bribes, falsifying corporate financial records, and hiding $18 million of stolen client pension funds in offshore shell companies located in the Cayman Islands. The hostile energy in the glamorous ballroom was rapidly reaching a boiling point. Wealthy guests were openly pointing their fingers at our table. The sneers, the judgmental glares, and the cruel insults merged into a suffocating, unbearable wall of noise. "You should leave right now," someone shouted angrily from the middle of the room. "Have some basic dignity and walk out the door." Another angry voice quickly joined the growing chorus. "Pay the enormous bill you owe them and get out of here. You do not belong with us." The security guards shifted their weight heavily, stepping even closer to the back of my chair, clearly waiting for Gavin or my father to give the final official order to physically drag us out into the street. My mother stood victorious on the stage, elegantly wiping her fake tears, watching the angry mob turn against me with absolute sickening satisfaction. She had weaponized the entire room in a matter of minutes. She had successfully isolated me, humiliated me, and branded me a toxic outcast in front of the most powerful people in the financial district. The pressure was incredibly intense, mathematically designed to make me break down, beg for their mercy, or run away hiding my face in tears. But I did not break. I did not shed a single tear. I just tightened my firm grip on Nathaniel's warm hand. The angry elite mob desperately wanted blood, but they had absolutely no idea whose blood was actually going to be spilled tonight. Gavin smirked, raising his hand to signal the massive security guards hovering just inches behind our chairs. It was the universal gesture of a coward outsourcing his dirty work. The head guard, a hulking man with a thick neck and an earpiece, stepped forward. He reached out with a meaty hand, fully intending to grab my husband by the collar of his suit jacket and drag him backward across the expensive hotel carpet. Before the guard's fingers could even brush the fabric of his suit, Nathaniel moved. It was not a frantic, panicked motion. It was a fluid, calculated shift of weight that completely disrupted the guard's trajectory. Nathaniel pushed his chair back and stood up to his full height. The sudden, imposing vertical presence of my husband seemed to suck the oxygen right out of our dark corner of the ballroom. "Do not touch me," Nathaniel said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a sharp metallic edge that sliced through the ambient noise of the jeering crowd. The wealthy investors and arrogant executives sitting at the nearby tables paused their cruel laughter. There was something deeply unsettling about a man who had just been publicly humiliated and threatened with physical removal, acting with such absolute chilling authority. Gavin took a half-step backward, his false bravado faltering for a fraction of a second before he puffed out his chest again. "Throw him out!" Gavin yelled, his voice cracking slightly under the sudden pressure. "Throw them both out into the alley where they belong. They are trespassing on a private corporate event." The head guard recovered from his momentary hesitation. He squared his broad shoulders, nodding to the three other heavily built security personnel who quickly flanked him, forming a solid muscular wall between our table and the brightly lit stage. "Sir, it is time to leave," the head guard growled, cracking his knuckles aggressively. "You can walk out the kitchen service doors quietly, or we can make this incredibly painful for you. Your choice." Nathaniel did not look at the exit. He fixed his gaze directly on my father, who was still standing behind the crystal podium on the stage, watching the scene with a look of supreme satisfaction. Nathaniel took a deliberate step forward, walking straight toward the impenetrable wall of security guards. I remained seated, my back perfectly straight, watching my husband execute the first phase of our counterattack. For years, my family had mistaken Nathaniel's quiet demeanor for weakness. They assumed that because he did not brag about his salary or wear flashy watches, he was a failure. They failed to understand that truly powerful men do not need to shout to command a room. They simply act. The head guard moved to block Nathaniel's path, planting his heavy boots firmly on the carpet and raising both hands to shove my husband backward. "I warned you, buddy," the guard snarled, lunging forward to initiate the physical altercation. Nathaniel did not raise his fists to block the incoming assault. Instead, his right hand blurred toward the inner breast pocket of his jacket. In a fraction of a second, he withdrew a heavy dark leather wallet. With a sharp flick of his wrist, the wallet flipped open, catching the glare of the grand chandeliers overhead. Inside the leather casing rested a thick, solid piece of custom-molded metal, a federal badge. Nathaniel did not just show the badge to the guard. He stepped directly into the man's aggressive personal space and slammed the heavy metal badge flat against the center of the head guard's chest. The dull thud of the metal hitting the guard's sternum echoed sharply in the immediate vicinity. The head guard froze instantly, his massive arms dropping limply to his sides as if he had just been electrocuted. He looked down at the badge pressed firmly against his chest. I watched from my seat as the aggressive, violent color completely drained from the guard's face, leaving him a sickly, terrifying shade of pale gray. "Read it," Nathaniel commanded, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet whisper meant only for the security team. "Read every single word etched into that metal, and then ask yourself if protecting a corrupt fund manager is worth spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for assaulting a government official." The head guard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He stared at the bold, undeniable lettering of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. He stared at the gold seal, the serial number, and the terrifying weight of federal authority resting right against his heart. "Stand down." The head guard choked out, his voice trembling uncontrollably. He frantically waved his hands at his three subordinates, who were still confused by their boss's sudden surrender. "I said stand down right now. Back away from him." The impenetrable wall of muscle parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path leading directly from our dark corner straight to the brightly lit stage. The guards retreated, keeping their hands completely visible and raised in the air, wanting absolutely no part in whatever devastation Nathaniel was about to unleash. The sudden submission of the security team sent a shockwave of profound confusion rippling through the ballroom. The wealthy guests who had been demanding our removal just moments ago fell completely silent. They exchanged nervous, bewildered glances. Why had the massive security team just surrendered to a lowly database manager? Why was the head guard sweating and physically shaking? Gavin stood near the edge of the stage, his arrogant smirk melting into a mask of pure panic. "What are you idiots doing?" Gavin screamed at the retreating guards. "I told you to throw him out. Do your jobs." The head guard did not even look at Gavin. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, stepping further back into the shadows of the room, completely abandoning the Vanguard executives to their fate. Nathaniel adjusted his suit jacket, returning the leather wallet to his pocket with a smooth, practiced motion. He did not rush. He walked down the center aisle of the ballroom with the slow, measured, terrifying stride of an executioner approaching the block. The clack of his dress shoes against the hardwood borders of the carpet sounded like the ticking of a countdown clock. He passed tables filled with billionaires, politicians, and banking executives. These people who had sneered at us all evening now instinctively pulled their chairs and shrinking back as Nathaniel walked past them. The sheer undeniable gravity of his presence demanded absolute submission. On the stage, my father's confident posture began to crack. He gripped the edges of the crystal podium tightly, his knuckles turning white. He looked down at Nathaniel approaching the stairs, trying to maintain his mask of superiority, but the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his rising fear. My mother. Patricia took a hesitant step backward, her fake tears drying up instantly as raw, genuine dread began to take hold. Melissa, standing in her expensive custom gown, looked frantically between her cowardly husband Gavin and the advancing figure of my husband. She opened her mouth to shout another insult, to demand order, to reassert her dominance, but no words came out. The air in the room had grown too thick, too heavy with impending doom. Nathaniel reached the bottom of the stage steps. He did not ask for permission to ascend. He walked up the velvet-lined stairs, stepping directly into the blinding glare of the spotlight that had been reserved solely for the vanguard elite. He was no longer the quiet man sitting in the shadows. He was the storm they had unknowingly invited into their home. Nathaniel crested the top of the velvet-lined stairs and stepped fully onto the raised platform. The bright theatrical spotlights previously reserved for my mother's grand delusions of grandeur now illuminated his sharp features. He did not look angry. He looked entirely in control, possessing the kind of lethal calm that makes powerful men sweat. My father Richard stood frozen behind the thick crystal podium. For a man who had spent his entire life bullying subordinates and intimidating his own family, he looked remarkably small right now. He puffed out his chest, attempting to muster one final shred of his manufactured authority. "Listen here, Richard," hissed his voice, dropping low, so the microphone would not pick it up. "I do not know what kind of stunt you think you are pulling, but you are going to walk off this stage right now, or I will personally see to it that you are locked in a holding cell for the rest of the year." Nathaniel did not even break his stride. He did not blink, and he certainly did not stop. He walked directly up to my father, invading his personal space with such absolute unyielding dominance that Richard instinctively stumbled backward. The heel of my father's expensive Italian leather shoe caught the edge of the microphone cable, causing him to flail his arms wildly just to keep his balance. He looked ridiculous, a fake king tripping over his own invisible robes. Nathaniel reached out and took a firm grip on the neck of the microphone stand. He adjusted it smoothly to his own height. Then he looked down at my father, who was now cowering a few feet away, clutching his chest. "Your authority in this room expired the moment I stood up," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet but carrying a terrifying finality. "Go stand with your wife and watch your empire burn." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He looked at Nathaniel, then looked out at the silent, expectant crowd of 150 elite guests, and realized he had completely lost control of the narrative. Defeated and shaking, my father retreated to the side of the stage, standing next to a visibly trembling Patricia. Melissa and Gavin watched in pure, unadulterated horror as the database manager they had mocked all evening officially hijacked their multi-million-dollar corporate event. Nathaniel turned his attention to the vast ballroom. He tapped the top of the microphone with his index finger. The sharp, percussive sound echoed off the ornate ceilings, commanding the absolute attention of every single billionaire, investor, and socialite in the room. The hostility that had filled the air just moments ago had completely evaporated. The crowd was no longer an angry mob demanding my head on a platter. They were a captive audience paralyzed by the sudden dramatic shift in power. They held their collective breath, their champagne flutes suspended halfway to their mouths, waiting to see what this mysterious man was going to do next. "I must apologize for the sudden interruption," Nathaniel began. His voice resonated deeply through the state-of-the-art sound system, smooth, confident, and dripping with razor-sharp sarcasm. "I know how much you all were enjoying this touching display of family unity. It is not every day you get to witness a mother publicly sacrifice her eldest child on the altar of corporate greed, all while wearing a custom silk gown." A collective gasp rippled through the front row tables. A few wealthy executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly realizing they had been cheering for a public execution just minutes prior. But I am afraid I have to bring this little theatrical production to an early close. Nathaniel continued gripping the sides of the podium. You see, I have been sitting in the back corner of this room all evening listening to these elaborate speeches. I listened to Richard praise his youngest daughter as a ruthless wolf of industry. I listened to Patricia cry fake tears about being overworked and exhausted. I listened as they painted a vivid, highly detailed picture of a useless, ungrateful daughter who refused to embrace their supposedly glorious legacy. He paused, letting his gaze sweep slowly across the room, making eye contact with the very people who had shouted insults at me. It was a fascinating story, Nathaniel said, his tone turning dangerously cold. Beautifully acted, passionately delivered. There is just one massive, undeniable problem with everything that has been said on this stage tonight. It is an absolute complete fabrication. A desperate, pathetic lie told by desperate, pathetic people who are trying to hide their own catastrophic failures. My mother let out a sharp, offended gasp. How dare you, Patricia shrieked, taking a step forward. Her perfectly styled hair was beginning to frizz, and her face was flushed with ugly, mottled red patches of pure panic. Turn off his microphone right now. Turn it off. Nathaniel did not even look at her. He simply raised his hand, pointing a single finger directly at her, a silent command that stopped her dead in her tracks. She froze, her mouth hanging open, entirely paralyzed by the sheer force of his presence. I am not finished, Nathaniel said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. You wanted an audience tonight, Patricia. You invited the most powerful people in the city to witness your supposed triumph. So they are going to hear the rest of the story. They are going to hear exactly how this fake coronation ends. He turned back to face the crowd, leaning closer to the microphone. The silence in the room was so profound, it felt heavy, pressing down on the chests of everyone present. No one dared to speak. No one dared to look away. Richard stood on this stage and confidently declared that he was cutting his eldest daughter out of the family trust. Nathaniel announced, a dark, mocking amusement dancing in his eyes. He proudly claimed that this family does not fund mediocrity. He stated that Rebecca is merely a supporter, not a leader. He painted her as a struggling tutor, a nobody, a ghost haunting the edges of their magnificent empire. Nathaniel slowly turned his head, locking his piercing gaze directly onto my parents. Patricia and Richard stood shivering together under the bright stage lights, their arrogant facades completely shattered. Melissa clutched Gavin's arm, her eyes wide with mounting terror, finally realizing that the ground beneath their feet was about to collapse. I sat in my dark corner at the back of the room, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I watched my husband command the room with breathtaking precision. He was a master surgeon, and he was about to deliver the final fatal incision to their carefully constructed lies. So I have a very simple question for Richard and Patricia, Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that forced every person in the room to lean forward just to hear him. A question that every single person in this ballroom should be asking themselves right now. He stared directly into my mother's panicked eyes. Do you people even know who your daughter really is? The question hung in the air like a live grenade. It echoed off the crystal chandeliers and the gold-trimmed walls. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for the explosion. My parents stared back at him in sheer, unadulterated horror, the realization finally dawning on them that they had made a catastrophic, unforgivable mistake. They had no idea who I was, and they were about to find out in the most painful way possible. For a long, agonizing moment, my mother simply stared at Nathaniel, her brain completely short-circuiting as it tried to process his blatant disrespect. The idea that this quiet, unassuming man was challenging her supreme authority in front of her most powerful peers was a reality she fundamentally refused to accept. Her shock rapidly mutated into a desperate, frantic rage. Patricia lunged toward the crystal podium, her custom silk gown snapping around her ankles. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She pointed a shaking finger right between Nathaniel's eyes, her voice raising to an unhinged, shrill shriek that battered the ballroom walls. "Security!" Patricia screamed, abandoning all pretense of elegant high society grace. "I want this man removed immediately. Drag him out of my sight. He is a struggling, pathetic, IT worker who has completely lost his mind. Gavin, do something. Someone get this delusional. Nobody off my stage right now. She looked frantically around the room, expecting the massive security guards to rush forward and fulfill her absolute command. She expected the wealthy executives to stand up and defend her honor. She expected Gavin to throw a punch. Instead, absolutely nothing happened. Gavin remained cemented to the floor near the front tables, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. The security guards were nowhere to be seen, having already retreated far into the shadows near the kitchen doors the second they recognized what they were dealing with. The elite guests remained frozen in their velvet chairs, watching the matriarch of Vanguard Trust unravel on live display. Nathaniel did not step back from her aggressive advance. He did not raise his voice to match her frantic screaming. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket for the second time that evening. Patricia continued to rant, her voice echoing harshly through the microphone Nathaniel still gripped. "You are a failure, Nathaniel. You and my useless daughter are nothing but parasites, trying to ruin the most important night of my life. You are trespassing. You are going to jail." Nathaniel withdrew the heavy dark leather wallet. He held it up, holding it perfectly steady under the glaring theatrical spotlights. With a deliberate, practiced flick of his wrist, the leather casing fell open. The heavy custom-molded gold shield embedded inside caught the brilliant light of the chandeliers, reflecting a blinding, undeniable flash of absolute federal authority directly into Patricia's eyes. He did not just show it to her. Nathaniel placed the heavy federal badge flat on the surface of the crystal podium, positioning it right next to the microphone so that anyone close to the stage could see the terrifying government seal. Then Nathaniel leaned intimately close to the microphone. His voice was no longer conversational. It dropped into a low, resonant, and entirely lethal register that commanded absolute, unquestioning submission. "My name is Nathaniel Adams," he announced, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "I am the senior lead investigator for the United States Securities and Exchange Commission Division of Enforcement." The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a suffocating physical vacuum. The air was instantly sucked out of the grand ballroom. 150 powerful elite guests stopped breathing simultaneously. And as a federal agent, Nathaniel continued, his eyes locked dead onto my mother's suddenly bloodless face. "I am officially declaring this private ballroom an active federal crime scene." The psychological shockwave hit the room like a localized earthquake. The reaction was visceral, immediate, and utterly chaotic. These were not ordinary citizens. These were billionaire hedge fund managers, ruthless investment bankers, and corporate lawyers. They were the apex predators of the financial district, and they knew exactly what the presence of a senior SEC investigator meant. It meant total catastrophic devastation. A wealthy Vanguard board member sitting in the front row dropped his crystal champagne flute. The expensive glass hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces, the sharp cracking sound snapping the crowd out of their paralysis. Total panic erupted. It was not a loud, screaming panic, but a quiet, terrifying scramble for self-preservation. Men in $1,000 tuxedos immediately reached into their pockets, frantically dialing their private legal counsel. Women draped in diamonds grabbed their luxury handbags, their eyes darting wildly toward the heavy wooden exit doors. But no one ran for the exits. Nathaniel raised his hand, a simple gesture that halted the wealthy mob in their tracks. "I strongly suggest everyone remain in their seats," Nathaniel commanded smoothly over the rising murmurs. "Federal agents are currently stationed at the lobby, exits the service elevators, and the parking garage. No one leaves this venue until my team has secured the premises. If you are just a guest here to enjoy the free champagne, you have nothing to worry about. If you are a member of the Vanguard Trust Executive Board, however, I suggest you retain your current attorneys on speed dial." The self-serving nature of high society revealed itself in a matter of seconds. The wealthy friends and loyal corporate partners who had been cheering for my parents just moments ago instantly turned on them. The guests seated at the tables closest to the stage physically stood up and dragged their chairs backward, desperately trying to create a massive visible distance between themselves and my family. No one wanted to be caught in a photograph or even share the same breathing space with the primary targets of a massive federal probe. My parents were suddenly treated like they were highly infectious. On the stage, Patricia's brain fundamentally refused to process the reality unfolding in front of her. She stared at the gold SEC badge resting on the podium, her eyes wide and uncomprehending. She shook her head side to side, a pathetic childlike gesture of denial. No, Patricia stammered, her voice completely devoid of its previous arrogant venom. No, this is a joke. This is a sick, vindictive prank. You are a database manager. You fix computers. Richard, tell him to stop this immediately. She turned to my father for salvation, but Richard was completely paralyzed. His legal instincts had finally kicked in, overriding his massive ego. He stared at Nathaniel's cold, calculating eyes, and the horrifying truth finally dawned on him. Nathaniel's quiet demeanor over the past 3 years was never a sign of weakness. His lack of boasting his simple suits, his refusal to engage in petty family arguments, it was all textbook operational discipline. Nathaniel had not been passively attending our toxic family dinners. He had been conducting deep cover surveillance. He had been quietly building a federal case right inside their own home. Richard stumbled backward, his knees practically buckling under the weight of his realization. He looked down at Gavin, who was now leaning heavily against a dining table, his face buried in his hands, sweating profusely. He looked at Melissa, whose arrogant sneer had melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The entire family legacy, the Vanguard Empire, and their precious social standing were vaporizing in real time. "You are lying," Patricia whispered, her hands gripping her custom silk gown as if she were trying to hold herself together. "The SEC does not crash retirement parties because of family drama. You have no jurisdiction here. We are a private, highly respected financial institution. We have done nothing wrong." Nathaniel did not smile. He simply stared down at the woman who had spent decades psychologically torturing her own daughter. He looked at her not as a son-in-law, but as an apex predator cornering its wounded prey. "You are absolutely right about one thing," Patricia, Nathaniel said, his voice echoing coldly over the panicked whispers of the ballroom. "The Securities and Exchange Commission does not waste federal resources on petty family disputes. We do not care who you invite to dinner, and we certainly do not care about your pathetic inheritance threats." He leaned closer to her, his towering presence casting a long, dark shadow over her trembling figure. "We only show up," Nathaniel whispered into the microphone, ensuring every single terrified investor in the room heard his next words. "When someone is arrogant enough to steal $18 million from the pension funds of hard-working American citizens." $18 million, Nathaniel repeated, letting the massive number hang heavily in the dead silence of the ballroom. His voice was a low, lethal hum that carried effortlessly across the lavish space. Not corporate profits, not venture capital, pension funds. The life savings of teachers, factory workers, and municipal employees who trusted Vanguard with their futures. "You systematically drained their accounts," Patricia, siphoning off fractions of a percent over the course of 5 years, so no one would notice the bleed. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a tightly bound, thick manila folder. He dropped it onto the crystal podium right next to his federal badge. The heavy thud made my mother violently flinch. "Inside this folder are the highly classified wire transfer logs," Nathaniel stated, tapping the cover with his index finger. "We tracked every single stolen dollar as it left your supposedly secure regional branch. You routed the money through a complex web of dummy corporations, eventually landing it in 3 offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. You thought you were brilliant. You thought hiding it behind a maze of international corporate law would keep you safe. But you left a digital footprint wide enough to drive a federal convoy through." The reaction from the ballroom was immediate and brutal. The wealthy guests who just moments ago had been cheering for my mother's glorious career were now looking at her with absolute, unfiltered revulsion. In their world, aggressive corporate tactics were applauded, but stealing from working-class pension funds was a sloppy, disgusting crime that brought the unwanted heat of the federal government straight to their doorsteps. And that brings us to the grand illusion of tonight's magnificent event. Nathaniel continued, his eyes sweeping across the horrified crowd. You invited the most powerful people in New York to celebrate your incredible legacy. You stood on this stage playing the victim, crying about how exhausted you were, claiming you were stepping down to pass the torch to your golden child. It was a spectacular performance, truly worthy of an award. He leaned closer to the microphone, his expression hardening into pure ice. But let us share what actually happened yesterday evening. At precisely 6 o'clock last night, the Vanguard Board of Directors held an emergency closed-door meeting. I know this because my team was sitting in the boardroom with them. We presented the chairman with a fraction of our forensic audit. You were not given a luxurious early retirement, Patricia. You were brutally ousted. My mother staggered backward as if she had been physically struck. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with mounting terror. You were handed an ultimatum to resign immediately or face a public perp walk out of the Vanguard lobby in handcuffs, Nathaniel announced to the shocked audience. This party is not a celebration. It is a desperate, pathetic smokescreen. You threw this lavish event to maintain appearances just long enough to liquidate your domestic assets. You planned to smile, drink champagne, and board a private flight to a non-extradition country before the federal indictments were formally unsealed on Monday morning. The ballroom exploded into chaos. The Vanguard executives present, who had been clapping for my mother just moments ago, were now visibly shaking with rage and panic. A senior vice president stood up, pointing a shaking finger directly at my father. "Richard, you assured us this transition was standard procedure," the executive shouted across the room, his face purple with fury. "You swore the regional books were clean. My clients are tied up in those funds." My father, the brilliant corporate lawyer who prized self-preservation above all else, instantly threw his wife under the bus. The united, arrogant front they had maintained for decades evaporated in a matter of seconds. "I knew nothing about this," Richard yelled back, taking 2 massive steps away from Patricia as if she were carrying a highly contagious plague. He raised his hands in surrender, sweating profusely under the stage lights. "My personal finances are entirely separate from her regional branch. If she manipulated the books, she acted completely alone. I am a victim of her deception, just like the rest of you." Patricia looked at her husband in absolute shock. The betrayal shattered whatever was left of her pristine facade. "Richard, how could you?" she gasped, her voice trembling violently. "We did this together. You drew up the paperwork. You signed off on the offshore accounts. Save the confessions for the interrogation room," Nathaniel commanded, cutting off their pathetic domestic dispute with sharp authority. "The fact remains that your entire legacy is built on stolen money. You stand up here wearing custom silk and diamonds bought with the retirement funds of elderly citizens. You look down on my wife, a woman who actually earns an honest living, and you have the sheer audacity to call her a parasite." Melissa, still standing on the stage, looked like she was going to be physically sick. Her pristine, perfect world was collapsing all around her. Her husband Gavin was still frozen near the dining tables, completely ruined by his own financial failures, and her parents were turning on each other on a live microphone. But Melissa was a lawyer, and her desperate, toxic need to win overpowered her common sense. She stepped forward, her hands shaking so violently she could barely point her finger at Nathaniel. "This is illegal!" Melissa screamed, her voice cracking hysterically. "You cannot just walk in here and declare us guilty. We have elite corporate lawyers. Vanguard Trust was just audited by an independent firm." She turned to the crowd, desperately trying to salvage the situation, grasping at the last available straw to save herself from going down with the sinking ship. "We hired the most ruthless forensic accounting agency in the country," Melissa yelled, her eyes wild with panic. "They certified our regional branch was totally clean. You have no solid proof. You are just a bitter, jealous man trying to ruin us because we refuse to pay for your cheap lifestyle. We have the backing of the best corporate auditors in New York, and they will prove you wrong." Melissa's voice cracked on the final syllable, echoing desperately across the cavernous ballroom. She stood on her tiptoes, chest heaving, waiting for the room to rally behind her defensive shield of corporate jargon. She truly believed invoking the name of a legendary auditing firm would force the federal government to back down, but high society does not operate on loyalty. It operates on ruthless self-preservation. The mere mention of a federal raid, combined with the incredibly specific details Nathaniel had just dropped regarding Cayman Island shell companies, was the absolute kiss of death. In the financial sector, perception is reality. An SEC investigation is a toxic stain that washes away billions in client trust in a matter of seconds. I sat perfectly still and watched the dominoes begin to fall. At the table closest to us, a prominent venture capitalist pulled a sleek silver smartphone from his tuxedo jacket. He did not bother lowering his voice. "Get our legal team on the line right now," he barked into the receiver, waving off a waiter who tried to pour him more champagne. "Initiate an immediate freeze on all assets tied to Vanguard Trust. I want every single dollar routed out of their regional accounts before the market opens on Monday. If the SEC is raiding them, I am not getting caught in the blast radius." Across the room, the scene repeated itself like a highly choreographed panic. The polite, restrained atmosphere of the retirement gala completely disintegrated. Dozens of glowing screens illuminated the dim ballroom as the wealthiest people in New York scrambled to protect their fortunes. The soft classical music played by the string quartet was entirely drowned out by the harsh, overlapping sounds of frantic dial tones and panicked orders. "Sell the shares," a woman in a diamond necklace commanded into her phone, marching briskly toward the exit. "Dump everything connected to Patricia." On the stage, my mother watched her elite empire evaporate in real time. These were the people she had kissed up to for 30 years. These were the friends she had prioritized over her own flesh and blood. And now they were treating her like a walking contagion. She reached out, trying to grab the arm of a passing board member who was hurrying toward the coat check. "David, please," Patricia pleaded, her voice thick with genuine terror. "You know me. We play golf every weekend. This is a massive misunderstanding." The board member yanked his arm away violently, smoothing his custom sleeve as if she had physically stained it. "I do not know you, Patricia," he hissed coldly. "As of this exact second, Vanguard Trust has absolutely no affiliation with you or your family. You are completely on your own." That brutal rejection severed the last remaining thread of sanity holding my family together. The united front of the perfect, untouchable dynasty shattered into a million jagged pieces. Gavin, who had been sweating profusely by the dining tables, suddenly snapped. The realization that he was totally broke, publicly humiliated, and now facing a massive federal indictment pushed him right over the edge. He stormed toward the stage, his face contorted with a mixture of terror and absolute rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my father. "You set me up!" Gavin screamed, his voice raw and echoing off the high walls. "You told me those shell companies were totally insulated. You promised me the legal structure was bulletproof." Richard recoiled, his eyes darting frantically toward the wealthy guests who had stopped their phone calls just to witness the implosion. "Keep your mouth shut, you imbecile," Richard hissed, desperately trying to cover the microphone with his hand. "Are you out of your mind? I am not taking the fall for this!" Gavin roared, slapping Richard's hand away from the microphone stand, ensuring every single word was amplified across the ballroom. "You drafted the offshore incorporation papers. You are the lawyer. You told Patricia exactly how to route the stolen pension funds so the internal auditors would miss it. You used my name on the LLCs because you were too much of a coward to put your own signature on the dirty money." The collective gasp from the remaining audience was deafening. Gavin had just provided the SEC with a loud, public, and highly detailed confession of conspiracy and wire fraud. "Shut up!" Melissa shrieked, grabbing her husband by the shoulders and trying to physically drag him away from the podium. "Gavin, stop talking! You are giving them everything." Gavin violently shoved his wife away. "Do not tell me to shut up!" he bellowed, spit flying from his lips. "Your mother is the one who stole the money. Your father is the one who hid it. They promised me a massive cut if I just signed the director paperwork. I am not spending the next 20 years in a federal prison while your parents hire expensive defense attorneys with my cut of the cash. Richard lunged forward, grabbing Gavin by the collar of his dress shirt. You pathetic, incompetent fool, my father spat, his polished demeanor entirely replaced by the vicious cornered animal he truly was. You spent every single dime of your cut on luxury cars, country club dues, and gambling debts. You are completely broke. You could not even afford gas for your SUV. If I go down for this, I am dragging you right down to the bottom of the ocean with me. Patricia grabbed her husband's arm, sobbing uncontrollably now. Richard, stop! The microphone is still on. Everyone is listening, but the warning fell on dead ears. The stage had transformed into a vicious, ugly arena of pure self-preservation. They were tearing each other apart, trading insults, exposing secrets, and offering up confessions with reckless, terrified abandon. Melissa screamed at her parents for ruining her career. Richard screamed at Gavin for being a careless liability. Patricia wept, demanding someone fix the nightmare she had created. I sat in the back corner of the ballroom, sipping a glass of ice water. My ruined wine-stained dress no longer felt like a mark of shame. It felt like battle armor. Nathaniel stood beside our table, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the circular firing squad with a look of supreme clinical satisfaction. He had not needed to raise his voice. He had not needed to draw a weapon. He simply turned on the lights and let the cockroaches devour each other. Melissa, hyperventilating and shaking, scrambled back to the microphone. She gripped the edges of the podium, staring out at the terrified, disgusted crowd, grasping desperately for the one thing she believed could still save them. None of this matters, Melissa yelled, her voice hoarse and frantic. It does not matter what anyone says on this stage. The federal government cannot touch us. Vanguard Trust just completed a massive independent review. We hired Apex Intelligence. She repeated the name of the elite forensic auditing firm like it was a magical incantation. Apex Intelligence cleared our books! Melissa shrieked, pointing her finger fiercely at Nathaniel. They are the most ruthless, brilliant financial investigators on the planet, and they signed a legally binding document stating our branch is completely innocent. You are a low-level government agent. You do not have the power to overturn an Apex certification. They will bury your investigation. We are protected. The room fell totally silent again. Melissa stood panting, staring at Nathaniel, convinced she had just played the ultimate, unbeatable trump card. She truly believed that the legendary corporate shield of Apex Intelligence would deflect the federal raid and save her miserable family from ruin. She had absolutely no idea that the executioner was sitting right in front of her. I slowly set my water glass down on the white tablecloth. My fingers brushed the cool leather of my cheap handbag, slipping past the clasp to find the smooth, cold metal resting at the bottom. But I did not pull it out just yet. I let my hand rest inside the bag, allowing my sister to fully hang herself with her own rope. Melissa took the momentary silence in the ballroom as a sign of weakness from Nathaniel. As the newly appointed regional director and a senior legal executive, her survival instincts kicked into massive overdrive. She straightened her posture, gripping the sides of the crystal podium, and leaned aggressively into the microphone. You heard me? Melissa projected her voice, regaining its shrill, arrogant edge. Vanguard Trust just passed a comprehensive Tier 1 forensic audit. We contracted Apex Intelligence 3 months ago. They deployed their top-tier analysts to comb through every single transaction, every server, and every offshore routing protocol this branch executed over the last decade. She turned her furious gaze to the remaining wealthy guests who had paused their frantic retreat at the heavy wooden doors. The name Apex Intelligence carried a mythical weight in the financial district. It was the absolute gold standard of corporate forensics. If Apex certified a ledger, it was considered gospel. Even the federal government rarely challenged an Apex certified audit because their analysts were known to be entirely incorruptible and utterly ruthless. Do not let this rogue agent scare you, Melissa, commanded the crowd, her confidence surging rapidly. Under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, our independent forensic validation provides us with total corporate immunity against baseless federal harassment. We have the official Apex certification documents locked in our corporate vault. They signed off on our Cayman portfolios. They declared our regional operations completely flawless. My father Richard suddenly snapped back to life. The brilliant manipulative corporate lawyer saw the legal lifeline his daughter had just thrown him, and he grabbed it with both hands. He stepped away from Patricia, hastily smoothing down the wrinkled lapels of his tuxedo. My daughter is absolutely correct, Richard announced, his chest puffing out as he marched to stand beside Melissa. He pointed a defiant, shaking finger down at Nathaniel. You overplayed your hand, Adams. You might have a federal badge, but you do not have the jurisdiction to unilaterally override a certified Apex audit without a direct signed mandate from a federal judge. And I know for a fact you do not have that kind of warrant on a Friday night. The atmosphere in this grand ballroom shifted dramatically. The billionaires and investors lingering near the coat check exchanged calculating glances. The blind panic began to subside, replaced by the cold, cynical logic of Wall Street. If Vanguard Trust had the legendary shield of Apex intelligence protecting them, the SEC raid might actually fail. The money might be safe. Patricia noticed the crowd hesitating. The matriarch wiped the ruined mascara from under her eyes, her spine stiffening with renewed venomous arrogance. She stepped up to the microphone, flanking Melissa on the other side. We are victims of a federal witch hunt, Patricia declared to her wealthy peers, her voice dripping with fake outrage. This man is targeting my family because he is married to my bitter, jealous daughter. This is a personal vendetta, masked as an official investigation. But the truth is on our side. Apex Intelligence proved our innocence. Gavin, who had been cowering by the dining tables just moments before, let out a loud, obnoxious bark of laughter. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with a cloth napkin, his arrogant swagger flooding right back into his veins. You federal dogs really thought you had us, Gavin mocked, taking a confident step toward Nathaniel. You thought you could just waltz in here and scare us into a confession. But you forgot who you are dealing with. We employ the most vicious forensic accountants on Earth. They scoured our servers and they found absolutely nothing. You have no proof. You have a handful of circumstantial wire transfers that our legal team will easily justify in court by Monday morning. Melissa glared down at my husband from the stage, her eyes burning with a triumphant, malicious fire. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had outsmarted the United States government using the very corporate shield they all worshipped. You have nothing, Melissa spat into the microphone, ensuring her threat echoed across the entire room. First thing tomorrow morning, Vanguard legal team is filing a massive injunction against the SEC for harassment, defamation, and tortious interference. We are going to sue you into absolute oblivion. We will have your federal badge revoked. You will be blacklisted from the financial sector forever. And your pathetic, useless wife will be held equally liable for orchestrating this disgusting public stunt. She leaned forward, delivering her final definitive challenge. Apex Intelligence is our absolute armor. They are the highest authority in corporate finance, and they stand behind us. You cannot touch us. Nathaniel stood perfectly still at the bottom of the stage steps. He did not argue the legal statutes. He did not raise his voice to defend his investigation. He simply looked up at the arrogant, sneering faces of my family, and then he slowly turned his head to look back at me. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. They had played their final card. They had built their entire defense on the flawless, unassailable reputation of a single forensic auditing firm. They had boldly challenged the room, challenged the federal government, and staked their freedom on the firm belief that the legendary corporate entity known as Apex Intelligence was on their side. I pulled my hand out of my cheap handbag. My fingers gripped the smooth, heavy metal of a military-grade encrypted USB drive. I pushed my chair back from the dark corner table. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, a harsh sound that cut through the renewed murmurs of the elite crowd. It was time to shatter their armor into a million pieces. I stood up from the dark corner table. The heavy wooden legs of my chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor, a harsh, abrasive sound that cut perfectly through the renewed murmurs of the elite crowd. Every single eye in the massive ballroom immediately darted away from the brightly lit stage and locked directly onto me. I did not shy away from their intense, calculating stares. I stepped out from the shadows, standing at my full height. The cold, cheap fabric of my wine-stained dress clung tightly to my chest. Just an hour ago, that massive dark stain was meant to be a permanent badge of shame, a public branding of my utter worthlessness. Now, as I prepared to march into the spotlight, it felt entirely different. It felt like war paint. I walked forward. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my high heels echoed off the marble pillars. It was a steady, unyielding metronome counting down the final seconds of their corrupt dynasty. Nathaniel took a smooth step backward, giving me a clear, unobstructed path down the wide center aisle of the ballroom. He bowed his head slightly in a gesture of absolute, undeniable respect. The federal agent, the terrifying man, who had just brought billionaires to their knees with a single badge, was officially clearing the floor for me. That single, silent transfer of power sent a fresh wave of profound confusion rippling through the wealthy guests. They physically shrank back as I passed their tables. They did not know who I was, but they recognized the terrifying absolute certainty radiating from my every step. The judgmental whispers completely died in my wake. Up on the stage, the arrogant smirks on my family members' faces began to falter and crack. Melissa leaned heavily over the crystal podium, her knuckles turning bone white as she gripped the edges. "What do you think you are doing, Rebecca?" Melissa snapped, her voice trembling violently with a mixture of defensive anger and a brand new, unexplainable fear. "Sit back down in your corner. You are embarrassing yourself." I did not answer her. I reached the bottom of the velvet-lined stairs and began to climb. Patricia moved swiftly to block my path, throwing her arms out wide to barricade the top of the stairs. Her custom silk gown rustled aggressively in the quiet room. "Security!" Patricia shrieked, looking wildly toward the back of the room, completely forgetting that her private army had already surrendered. I said I want this woman removed right now. She has absolutely no right to be up here. The security guards remained plastered to the far walls, completely immobilized by Nathaniel's lingering presence on the floor below. No one was coming to save her. "Get out of my way, Patricia," I said. My voice was completely flat. I did not yell. I did not threaten. I delivered a statement of absolute, immovable fact. My mother actually recoiled. The sheer force of my command, entirely stripped of any daughterly submission or childhood fear, physically pushed her backward. She stumbled on her expensive heels, falling back into Richard, who had to catch her by the waist to keep her from tumbling to the floor. Richard puffed out his chest, desperately trying to salvage his shattered patriarchal authority. "You are making a massive mistake, Rebecca," my father warned his ruthless corporate lawyer, instincts flaring up defensively. "Whatever pathetic, vindictive stunt you and your husband have planned, it ends right now. You are interfering with a private corporate event. I will personally see to it that you are sued for everything you own." I walked right past him. I did not even spare him a single glance. He was entirely irrelevant now. My target was the massive audiovisual console situated on the far right side of the wide stage. Throughout the entire evening, the Master Control laptop had been projecting a sickeningly sweet, highly produced tribute video of my mother's career onto the giant 50-foot screen behind the podium. The massive display showed smiling photos of Patricia shaking hands with local politicians. It played high-definition clips of her cutting ribbons at charity events that were entirely funded by stolen pension money. It was a towering, glowing monument to their hypocrisy, broadcasting their fake legacy to the entire room. Gavin finally realized where I was heading. He lunged forward from the center of the stage, trying to cut me off before I reached the tech podium. "Do not touch that equipment," Gavin yelled, his face slick with nervous sweat. "That is strictly Vanguard property. You are destroying corporate hardware." Nathaniel's voice cracked like a whip from the ballroom floor below. "Take one more step toward my wife, Gavin, and I will formally add assaulting a federal witness to your indictment." Gavin froze instantly, his designer shoes skidding to an awkward halt on the stage floor. He raised his hands in immediate surrender, stepping rapidly back into the shadows like a beaten, terrified dog. I reached the audiovisual console. The hotel technician sitting behind the glowing monitors looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He did not try to stop me. He simply grabbed the armrests of his rolling chair and pushed himself backward, completely abandoning his post. I looked up at the giant screen behind the stage. Patricia's glowing, heavily edited face smiled down at the ballroom, accompanied by a soft, triumphant orchestral soundtrack flowing through the massive surround sound speakers. It was the perfect visual representation of the lie they had sold to the world for decades. I opened my right hand. Resting heavily in my palm was the military-grade encrypted USB drive. It was not a standard cheap plastic flash drive. It was encased in solid matte black titanium, built to survive extreme conditions, and engineered specifically to bypass complex corporate firewalls in a matter of seconds. It held the culmination of 7 years of my blood, my sweat, and my endless sleepless nights. It held the digital execution orders for every single person standing on this stage. I located the primary override port on the master control laptop. I did not hesitate. I shoved the titanium drive directly into the slot. The system recognized the military-grade encryption instantly. A black command prompt box popped up on the screen. I typed in a 12-character override password with rapid, practiced keystrokes, hitting the Enter key with a sharp, decisive strike. The effect was instantaneous and incredibly violent. The soft, triumphant orchestral music playing through the ballroom speakers cut off with a harsh, deafening electronic screech that made several guests in the front row cover their ears. The giant 50-foot screen directly behind my family flickered violently. Patricia's smiling fake face distorted into heavy digital static, tearing apart in a rapid cascade of pixelated blocks and scrambled code. Then the screen went completely, terrifyingly black. The sudden darkness plunged the back of the stage into heavy shadows. The abrupt, shocking silence in the massive ballroom was so absolute it felt like the entire building had stopped breathing. The elite crowd sat frozen, staring up at the massive black void looming over my family. Melissa whipped around to look at the dead screen, her chest heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. "What did you do?" Melissa demanded, her voice cracking with pure, unfiltered hysteria. "What did you just do to the presentation? Turn it back on." I stepped away from the audiovisual console and walked slowly to the dead center of the stage. I bypassed my father. I bypassed my mother. I stopped directly in front of the main crystal podium, taking the exact spot Melissa had occupied just moments before. I gripped the polished edges of the podium, the cold glass grounding me. I looked out at the vast sea of billionaires, hedge fund managers, and corrupt executives who were now hanging on to my every movement. I looked down at Nathaniel, who was watching me from the center aisle, with an expression of absolute, unyielding pride. Then I reached out and tapped the spacebar on the podium's linked keyboard. It was time to introduce them to the architect of their destruction. The massive 50-foot screen behind me flared to life with a blinding, brilliant white light. The sudden illumination cast long, dramatic shadows across the stage, completely washing out the warm golden glow of the hotel chandeliers. A deep, resonant bass note vibrated through the high-end surround sound speakers, demanding the absolute attention of every single person in the ballroom. Out of the stark white background, a sleek, razor-sharp logo materialized. It was a minimalist geometric crest forged in gunmetal gray and deep obsidian. Beneath the imposing crest, crisp modern typography spelled out two words that carried the weight of absolute corporate terror: Apex Intelligence. The reaction from the wealthy crowd was instantaneous. A collective audible gasp swept through the front row tables. These were Wall Street titans, men and women who managed billion-dollar portfolios. They recognized that silver crest immediately. To them, the Apex logo was not just a corporate brand. It was the undeniable symbol of financial execution. Seeing it projected on the main stage of a Vanguard retirement party was like watching a predator plant its flag on a freshly conquered territory. Melissa shielded her eyes from the glaring light of the screen. She looked up at the massive logo, her face twisting into a mask of profound, desperate confusion. She turned wildly toward the empty audiovisual console, then looked back at me. "What is this?" Melissa shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain of her mounting panic. "Turn that off right now." Why did you put their logo on our screen? I did not break eye contact with my sister. I leaned forward, bringing my lips just an inch away from the microphone. Just 2 minutes ago, I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the dead silent ballroom. You proudly announced to this entire room that Vanguard Trust passed a comprehensive forensic audit. You boldly claimed that Apex Intelligence cleared your regional branch. You stated with absolute arrogance that our analysts certified your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands as completely flawless. Patricia stumbled forward, gripping the crystal podium beside me to keep from collapsing. Her breath was coming in shallow, ragged gasps. What are you talking about? Patricia demanded, her eyes darting between me and the giant screen. You have nothing to do with Apex. You are a glorified tutor. I ignored my mother completely, keeping my lethal focus entirely on Melissa. You placed your entire defense, your freedom, and your corporate survival on the unassailable reputation of a single firm. I continued my words, striking like physical blows. You told a federal agent to back down because you believed you were protected by the highest authority in corporate finance. You challenged the United States government because you thought the corporate shield of Apex Intelligence was impenetrable. Melissa swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. Her hands shook so violently she had to press them flat against her expensive silk gown just to steady herself. You are absolutely right about one thing, Melissa, I announced, letting my voice ring out with absolute chilling authority. Apex Intelligence is never wrong. I know that very well because I am the one who signed the executive decision to found it 7 years ago. The silence in the grand ballroom shattered into a million pieces. The air pressure in the room seemed to violently implode. I looked directly into the terrified, wide eyes of my mother, my father, and my sister. I swept my gaze across the entire frozen audience of billionaires and executives, officially tearing off the pathetic disguise my family had forced me to wear for over 3 decades. Good evening, I declared, claiming my true throne. I am Rebecca, founder and chief executive officer of Apex Intelligence. My mother physically gave out. Patricia's knees buckled underneath her custom silk gown, and she collapsed heavily onto the carpeted floor of the stage. She did not faint, but her legs simply refused to support the crushing weight of the reality I had just dropped on her head. She sat sprawled on the stage, staring up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The daughter she had marginalized, the woman she had mocked and humiliated all evening, was the absolute apex predator of her entire industry. Richard grabbed the edge of the crystal podium, his knuckles turning stark white. As a veteran corporate lawyer, his brain was processing the catastrophic implications at a terrifying speed. He understood instantly that this was not a prank. He understood the brutal, inescapable trap they had willingly walked right into. No, Richard whispered, his voice trembling as he shook his head in violent denial. No, that is completely impossible. You live in a tiny apartment. You teach online classes. We have seen your bank statements. You saw the bank statements for my cover identity, I corrected him smoothly. You saw a woman who worked online. What you failed to realize was that I was not tutoring middle school children. I was actively training top-tier financial analysts, forensic accountants, and ethical hackers on how to systematically dismantle corrupt corporate empires just like yours. My tiny apartment was our first operational command center. I spent the last 7 years building a digital army while you were busy bragging about country club memberships. Melissa backed away from me, her expensive heels stumbling over the microphone cables. She looked at the giant Apex logo glowing behind me, and then she looked at Nathaniel standing on the ballroom floor with his federal badge. The horrifying connection finally locked into place in her mind. You set us up, Melissa gasped, her voice completely hollow. The SEC and Apex Intelligence. You and your husband, you coordinated this entire raid. I offered my sister a cold, razor-sharp smile. The absolute best part of this entire operation, Melissa, is that I did not even have to hack into your servers to find the stolen pension money. I did not have to break a single law to secure the evidence. You literally handed it to me on a silver platter. I turned my attention to Patricia, who was still weeping silently on the floor. 2 months ago, I explained, making sure every investor in the room heard the fatal error. When the Vanguard Board of Directors grew deeply suspicious of your bloated regional returns, you completely panicked, Patricia. You needed an ironclad alibi to hide the $18 million you stole. You demanded the board hire the most ruthless, unbribable firm in the country to legitimize your fake numbers, thinking your Cayman shell companies were clever enough to fool anyone. I stepped out from behind the podium, standing tall and victorious under the stage lights. You wrote a corporate check for $2 million, Patricia. You signed a legally binding contract granting us unrestricted total administrative access to every single server email account and private ledger in your entire network. You willingly handed the keys to your entire criminal enterprise directly to my firm. And we spent the last 8 weeks quietly tearing your empire apart from the inside out. I did not give them a single second to recover. I tapped the spacebar on the crystal podium keyboard. The giant screen behind me flashed, replacing the stark Apex Intelligence logo with a high-resolution scan of a banking document. It was a personal financial ledger, highly magnified so that every single digit and signature was visible to the guests sitting all the way in the back of the vast ballroom. For 30 years, my mother crafted a brilliant fictional narrative. I announced my voice steady and amplified. She told everyone in her high society circle that I was a lazy, ungrateful parasite. Tonight, Melissa boldly grabbed a microphone and demanded I pay $45,000 to compensate this family for housing and feeding me. She claimed I drained their resources. So let us look at the actual data. Because unlike my family, data does not manipulate, data does not lie. I pointed to the massive screen glowing behind me. This is the official statement for a college savings trust established in my name by my late grandmother when I was just 5 years old. By the time I turned 18, the fund had accumulated exactly $140,000. It was meant to cover my tuition at Columbia University, where I had just been accepted with early admission. It was my ticket to a secure future. I tapped the keyboard again. A bright red highlight appeared on the screen, circling a massive catastrophic withdrawal. As you can all clearly see, I continued, the tone of my voice dropping to a clinical icy chill precisely 2 weeks before my freshman semester began. The account was completely liquidated. Every single penny was drained. The authorized signature on the withdrawal slip belongs to Patricia. She sat me down in our living room and told me the market had crashed. She told me the investments had failed miserably and that I would have to figure out my own way to pay for school. She cried actual devastating tears when she told me that lie. She watched my heart break, and she comforted me with a hug. Another tap of the keyboard. A new document appeared side by side with the bank statement. It was an official bill of sale from a luxury exotic car dealership in Manhattan. The dates matched perfectly. The amounts matched down to the very last cent. My father, Richard, squeezed his eyes tightly shut and turned his head away, unable to look at the screen. Melissa suddenly looked like she could not breathe. She took a staggering step backward, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. $140,000, I stated, letting the massive number ring out across the silent room. You did not lose my college fund in a market crash, Patricia. You transferred it directly into a dealership account to purchase a custom cherry red Porsche Carrera. A completely frivolous, extravagant birthday present for your golden child, Melissa. You stole your eldest daughter's education to buy your youngest daughter a toy. The collective murmur of absolute disgust from the ballroom was undeniable and loud. Stealing from corporate clients was a severe federal crime, but stealing from your own child to buy a sports car for another was a profound moral bankruptcy that even the most ruthless Wall Street elites found repulsive. Women in the front row were shaking their heads, looking at my mother as if she were a monster. But I did not drop out. I said, shifting the narrative back to my own survival. I did not cry. I did not crawl back home and beg for scraps. I did not let your betrayal destroy my life. I pressed the space bar. The screen shifted again, this time displaying a rapid, overwhelming collage of scanned documents. Pay stubs, tax returns, university bursar receipts, and employee schedules filled the 50-foot display. I did not play the victim. I played the role of a CEO, delivering a flawless, indisputable quarterly report. These are my W-2 forms from my 4 years at university. I projected my voice filled with cold, undeniable pride. While Melissa was crashing her stolen Porsche into Hampton's country club gates and handing my father the expensive repair bills, I was working 3 jobs simultaneously. I worked the early morning shift at a campus coffee shop, opening the doors at 4 in the morning. I tutored struggling students every single afternoon. I scrubbed commercial office floors from midnight until 3 in the morning. I looked down at the wealthy crowd, making sure they understood the absolute magnitude of the contrast. I operated on 3 hours of sleep a night for 4 years. I ate leftover stale pastries from the coffee shop to survive. I paid for every single credit hour, every textbook, and every meal with my own blood and sweat. I graduated summa cum laude at the very top of my class without taking a single dime from the people standing on this stage. I built my empire with my own 2 hands, while you built yours on theft and deception. I turned my lethal focus back to Melissa, who was now trembling uncontrollably. Her arms wrapped tightly around her own stomach as if she were in severe physical pain. "You demanded I pay you back tonight, Melissa." I said, my words striking her like physical blows. "You called me a leech in front of this entire room. You mocked my clothes. You mocked my husband. The absolute staggering irony is that your entire existence has been funded by my stolen future and the stolen pensions of innocent working-class people. You are wearing my college tuition on your wrist right now. Your luxury cars, your designer gowns, your unearned corporate titles, they were all heavily subsidized by theft. You have never earned a single thing in your entire pathetic life." Patricia let out a ragged, desperate sob from her place on the floor. She tried to push herself up, her hands slipping against the polished wood of the stage. "Rebecca, please," my mother begged, her voice barely a miserable whisper. "We had to maintain our image. Melissa needed to look the part to get into Vanguard. I thought you were strong enough to handle it on your own. I knew you would survive." I stared down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no pity, just a cold, calculating emptiness. "You did not steal from me because you thought I was strong." "Patricia," I corrected her, delivering the absolute truth she had spent her life running from. "You stole from me because you thought I was weak. You thought I would just put my head down, accept the abuse, and quietly disappear into the background. You thought I would never fight back." I tapped the keyboard one more time. The screen flashed, preparing to display the next phase of their complete financial annihilation. "You severely underestimated your target," I announced. "And now you are going to pay the ultimate price for that miscalculation." The massive screen behind me shifted instantly from the collage of my college employment records to a stark, high-contrast financial schematic. It was a digital map of a sprawling corporate labyrinth. Bright red lines pulsed aggressively across the screen, connecting a central hub labeled Vanguard Trust Regional to dozens of small, obscure nodes scattered across the globe. I stepped away from the crystal podium, walking smoothly across the stage to stand directly in front of the towering graphic. I picked up a laser pointer from the audiovisual console. I clicked the button, sending a sharp green dot dancing across the intricate web of offshore accounts. "This is the anatomy of a massive federal crime," I announced, projecting my voice to the furthest corners of the silent ballroom. For the past 5 years, Patricia utilized her executive authority to approve hundreds of fake vendor invoices and phantom consulting fees. She systematically drained $18 million from the working-class pension funds managed by her branch. She did not take it all at once. She siphoned it off in careful, calculated microtransactions, hiding the theft deep within the complex daily trading volumes of a major financial institution. I guided the green laser pointer along the thickest red line on the screen. The line bypassed domestic banks entirely, routing through international servers before terminating at a cluster of 3 specific offshore entities registered in the Cayman Islands. "Let us look closely at the ultimate destination of those stolen funds," I instructed the crowd. The screen zoomed in on the 3 offshore nodes. Their corporate names flashed in bold white lettering: Obsidian Holdings, Vertex Capital, and Sterling Horizon, LLC. My father, Richard, took a sharp, gasping breath. He took another step backward, nearly tripping over the heavy stage curtains. His seasoned legal mind was rapidly processing the sheer amount of heavily classified data I was currently projecting to the entire financial district. Richard drafted the incorporation papers for these ghost companies, I declared, turning my head to glare at the sweating lawyer. He deliberately structured them to conceal the true beneficiaries. He set up layers of proxy directors and fake mailing addresses. But he made a fatal, arrogant mistake. He used Gavin and Melissa as the primary financial signatories on the offshore accounts, believing international privacy laws would shield them from domestic audits. Gavin frantically dug his phone out of his tuxedo pocket. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped the expensive device onto the stage floor. He tapped the screen with frantic, desperate strikes, bypassing his lock screen to open his highly encrypted offshore banking application. Melissa hovered tightly over his shoulder, her breath hitching in her throat as she stared at the loading symbol spinning on the small screen. "You are wasting your battery, Gavin," I said coldly. The acoustics of the grand ballroom carried my mocking tone perfectly. "You can refresh that application 1,000 times. The numbers are never going to change." Gavin stared at his phone screen. His jaw dropped open. His face lost every remaining drop of color, shifting into a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. He tapped the screen again, hitting the device against the palm of his hand, as if physical force could fix the catastrophic error message glowing in his face. "It says, access denied." Gavin choked out his voice, a panicked, high-pitched wheeze. "It says the balance is 0. Where is the money? What did you do to my accounts?" Melissa snatched the phone out of his hand, her eyes darting wildly across the digital banking interface. "The system locked us out," Melissa shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You hacked into our private servers. That is a federal cybercrime. We will have you arrested right now." I let out a slow, dark laugh. The sound echoed off the crystal chandeliers overhead. "I did not hack into anything, Melissa," I corrected her smoothly. "You see, when Patricia signed the $2 million contract granting Apex Intelligence total administrative access to your servers, she did not just give us permission to read your files. She gave us the highest level of executive security clearance. She gave us the master keys to the entire kingdom." I walked back to the crystal podium and tapped the spacebar on the keyboard. A massive, glaring red stamp materialized across the center of the 50-foot screen. The bold, terrifying letters slammed onto the display like a visual execution order. "Assets frozen." At exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon, I announced, ensuring every single terrified investor in the room heard the absolute finality of my words, while you were all getting dressed in your custom gowns and drinking pre-party champagne. My team at Apex executed a Level 5 financial lockdown. We coordinated directly with Nathaniel and the SEC Division of Enforcement. We bypassed your Cayman Island privacy shields using federal override protocols and the very security clearances Patricia signed over to us. My mother let out a wretched, guttural wail from her place on the floor. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the absolute reality of her total destruction finally crushed her. "We did not just trace the $18 million I stated staring down at my ruined family. We locked it down completely. We seized the offshore accounts. We froze your domestic checking accounts. We placed hard federal liens on your Beacon Hill mansion, your luxury vehicles, and your investment portfolios." I leaned forward over the podium, locking my eyes with Melissa, who was now weeping openly, her expensive makeup running down her face in ugly black streaks. "Every single financial artery tied to anyone on this stage has been completely severed," I promised her, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You cannot wire a single cent. You cannot withdraw cash from an ATM. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee on your way home. Your accounts are at absolute 0. The stolen money has been fully recovered and placed into a secure federal holding trust to be returned to the rightful pensioners." Gavin fell to his knees. The arrogant fund manager who had screamed at us to be thrown into the alley was now hyperventilating on the floor of the stage, tearing at his expensive silk tie as if it were choking him. "We have nothing," Gavin gasped between panicked sobs. "We have absolutely nothing left." "You have precisely what you earned," I corrected him. You built a lavish, arrogant lifestyle on the backs of hardworking people. You mocked my simple dresses and my husband's quiet career. You stood in this elite hotel and tried to publicly humiliate me over a dinner bill. But while you were busy playing rich, I was systematically cutting the safety nets right out from under you. I looked at my father, who was staring blankly at the massive red assets frozen stamp on the screen. The brilliant corporate lawyer had been entirely outmaneuvered by the daughter he deemed unworthy of his legacy. There are no hidden escape routes, I declared to my family. There are no secret emergency funds. You cannot bribe your way out of this because you have absolutely nothing left to offer. You are completely and utterly bankrupt. The echo of the word bankrupt hung in the chilled air of the ballroom. I watched the absolute psychological destruction of my family play out in real time. It was a spectacular, quiet implosion. There was no screaming now. The sheer magnitude of their defeat had stripped them of their vocal cords. I stepped back to the audiovisual console and tapped the keyboard one final time. The massive screen transitioned from the red lockdown stamp to a stark, high-definition display of 4 individual corporate incorporation documents. "Let us make this perfectly clear for the federal record," I announced, pointing the laser directly at the glowing signatures on the 50-foot screen. Patricia orchestrated the theft, and Richard drafted the blueprints. But the sole legally bound proprietors of Obsidian Holdings Vertex Capital and Sterling Horizon LLC are Melissa and Gavin. I moved the green laser dot over their enlarged, undeniable signatures. "You two did not just accept stolen money," I continued, my voice merciless and flat. "You willingly signed your names as the primary directors of international money laundering operations. You are not accessories to this crime. In the eyes of the federal government, you are the primary financial terrorists." That was the breaking point. The fragile string holding Gavin together completely snapped. His knees hit the hardwood stage with a sickening thud. The arrogant, untouchable fund manager who had commanded security guards to throw me out was now curled on the floor, gasping for air. He clawed at the collar of his expensive tuxedo shirt, ripping the buttons off in a desperate attempt to breathe. "I am going to federal prison." Gavin choked out, tears of pure terror spilling down his face. "They are going to lock me in a cage." I did not know. I just signed what Richard told me to sign. I am not a criminal mastermind. Melissa looked down at her sobbing husband in absolute disgust, but her own body was failing her. She stumbled backward, her custom silk gown tangling around her ankles. She looked at the giant screen displaying her signature, the definitive proof of her treason. The golden child, the perfect vanguard heir, was staring at a minimum 20-year federal sentence. She raised her trembling hands to her head, pulling at her perfectly styled hair. "This is not real," Melissa chanted under her breath, her eyes wide and unblinking. "This is a nightmare. I am the regional director. I am a respected lawyer. You cannot do this to me." "I did not do this to you, Melissa," I corrected her sharply. "Your greed did this. Your relentless toxic need to maintain a fake lifestyle did this. You sold your soul for a luxury car and a fake corporate title. Now the bill is due." I turned my gaze to my father. Richard stood near the edge of the stage, completely paralyzed. His face was the color of dirty ash. He had spent his entire career manipulating the legal system, finding loopholes and bullying opponents into submission. But standing before the irrefutable digital evidence compiled by Apex Intelligence, the veteran lawyer knew he was entirely trapped. There were no loopholes in my forensic audit. There was no backroom deal to be made with Nathaniel. Richard had built an illegal empire, and he had foolishly placed his own children right at the epicenter of the blast radius. "You destroyed us," Richard whispered, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming authority. "You destroyed your own family." "I protected innocent people from a family of predators," I countered immediately. "Do not dare play the victim, Richard. You built a house of cards on the backs of retired teachers and factory workers. The wind just finally blew it down." Patricia could no longer stand. She crawled across the stage floor, dragging her ruined silk dress behind her. She reached the crystal podium and grabbed the heavy base with both hands, using it to haul her trembling body upward. She clung to the clear acrylic edge like a shipwreck survivor clinging to a piece of driftwood. Her heavy makeup was entirely washed away by her tears, leaving her looking hollow-aged and thoroughly defeated. The matriarch looked out at the ballroom. The 150 elite guests, her supposed friends and loyal colleagues, stared back at her with a mixture of horror and cold apathy. No one offered a word of comfort. No one stepped forward to help her. The high society wall of pride she had meticulously constructed over 3 decades had been utterly pulverized by cold, hard numbers. Rebecca Patricia pleaded. Her voice was a wretched, pathetic rasp. "Please, I am your mother. Have mercy on us." I looked at the woman clinging to the podium. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse. I thought about the public humiliations, the stolen college fund, and the wine she had deliberately poured down my chest just hours ago. I walked right up to the podium, standing mere inches from her trembling face. "Mercy is a luxury reserved for those who show remorse," I told her, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal volume. "You are not sorry for what you did, Patricia. You are only sorry that you finally got caught by the daughter you thought was too stupid to stop you." I reached over and closed the master control laptop. The giant screen behind us instantly went black, plunging the stage back into its natural harsh lighting. The digital evidence was safely secured, and their psychological destruction was absolute. Their fake kingdom was entirely dismantled. My husband walked up the stairs of the stage. Nathaniel stood by my side, his presence a solid, comforting wall of strength. He looked down at my broken, weeping family with the objective detachment of a federal agent examining a closed case. "We are done here," Nathaniel announced to the room, officially concluding the interrogation. I did not need to say another word. The crushing silence of my family was the only victory speech I required. The crushing silence lasted only a few seconds before the spell completely broke. The stark realization of what had just transpired finally penetrated the shock of the elite crowd. Raw survival instinct took over. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, previously a bastion of high society elegance and untouchable wealth, rapidly transformed into a frantic, chaotic evacuation zone. Billionaires, hedge fund managers, and local politicians abruptly abandoned their half-eaten gourmet meals and glasses of expensive champagne. Heavy wooden chairs screeched harshly against the polished hardwood floors as guests scrambled to their feet in sheer panic. No one bothered to say goodbye to the hosts. No one offered a single word of sympathy or support. They moved with a collective, terrifying urgency, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive crater my family had just become. Women in heavy designer gowns hiked up their skirts, practically sprinting toward the exit doors. Men in custom tuxedos pushed past each other, shouting frantic orders into their cell phones, demanding their legal teams draft immediate severance notices for any professional or personal ties to Vanguard Trust. The mass exodus was brutally efficient. Within minutes, the vast opulent room was entirely stripped of its glamour, leaving behind a desolate wasteland of overturned chairs, discarded linen napkins, and half-empty wine glasses. My family stood on the brightly lit stage, completely abandoned, watching their glittering empire evaporate into thin air. The sudden, profound isolation stripped away the last remaining layers of their manufactured unity. When the wealthy audience vanished, the shared delusion of superiority that held them together violently fractured. Gavin was the first to completely break. The absolute certainty of a lengthy federal prison sentence shattered his cowardly, arrogant mind. He pushed himself off the floor, his face flushed with a dangerous, unhinged fury. He lunged across the stage, bypassing Richard entirely, and charged directly at his wife. He did not just yell, he roared, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger right into Melissa's tear-streaked face. "You lied to me," Gavin bellowed, his voice raw and cracking with pure panic. "You told me those documents were standard corporate liability forms. You looked me in the eye and swore the legal structure protected the directors. You tricked me into signing my own death warrant." Melissa stumbled backward, holding her hands up defensively. Her custom silk gown brushed against the base of the crystal podium. "Do not put this on me, Gavin," Melissa shrieked back, her voice matching his hysterical pitch. "You saw the bank statements. You knew exactly how much money was flowing into our personal accounts. You never asked any questions when we were buying sports cars and booking luxury villas. You happily spent the stolen money, and now you want to pretend you were just an innocent victim. I did not know it was stolen from pension funds, Gavin screamed, taking another aggressive step toward her, spit flying from his lips. I thought your mother was just skimming corporate profits. You set me up to take the fall for your family's massive federal crime. You used me as a human shield. Melissa's eyes darted wildly around the empty ballroom, searching for an escape that simply did not exist. Cornered and desperate, the golden child resorted to the only survival tactic she knew. She turned on her creator. Melissa whipped her head toward Patricia, who was still slumped weakly against the podium. "Do not look at me!" Melissa yelled at her husband, pointing a sharp, manicured finger violently at our mother. "She is the mastermind. She orchestrated the entire scheme. I just did what I was told. She is my superior at the firm, and she is my mother. I was following direct executive orders." Patricia gasped a harsh, ragged sound of pure, unadulterated betrayal. She stared up at the daughter she had worshipped, the daughter she had sacrificed my entire future to elevate. "Melissa," Patricia cried out, her voice breaking into a wretched, pathetic sob. "How could you say that? I did everything for you. I bought you that car I gave you, that promotion. I built this entire legacy so you would have a perfect life. A perfect life." Melissa laughed, a sharp, manicured sound, utterly devoid of any actual humor. "You built a federal trap. You used my signature because you were too cowardly to put your own name on the offshore accounts. You knew exactly what would happen if the SEC ever audited the regional branch. You intentionally made me the primary target so you could walk away cleanly." Richard stepped forward, attempting to physically insert himself between his wife and his youngest daughter. "Stop it!" Richard barked, his face pale and sweating profusely under the stage lights. "Stop yelling! Every word you scream is going straight into the federal agent's notebook. You are literally confessing to criminal conspiracy in front of the man who froze our assets." But the patriarch had absolutely zero authority left. His booming voice, which had ruled our household with an iron fist for 30 years, was completely ignored. "You are the one who drafted the fake incorporation papers," Gavin yelled at Richard, turning his furious rage onto my father. "You are a corporate lawyer. You told us the Cayman Islands accounts were untouchable. You are just as guilty as the rest of them." "I am a legal consultant," Richard shouted back, his defensive instincts flaring up wildly as he backed away. "I provided theoretical legal advice. I never authorized the transfer of stolen pension funds. Patricia executed those wire transfers entirely on her own." Patricia let out a guttural, devastating scream. She looked at her husband, the man she had shared a bed with for over 3 decades, and then at the daughter she had turned into a monster. They were actively feeding her to the wolves to save their own skins. The picture-perfect, untouchable family dynamic was dead. There was no loyalty, no love, no fierce protection. There was only raw, ugly greed and a desperate, cowardly scramble for the lifeboats. I stood quietly on the stage next to Nathaniel. I watched them tear each other to absolute shreds. They were ripping the flesh from each other's bones, screaming accusations, crying fake tears, and displaying the profound moral bankruptcy I had silently endured my entire life. The beautiful, carefully curated illusion of the Vanguard dynasty was reduced to a vicious screaming match on an empty stage in a deserted ballroom. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to hurl insults. I simply watched the inevitable implosion of a family that had built their entire foundation on toxic lies and stolen money. The fire I had started was now burning completely out of their control, and they were locking the doors on each other as the flames climbed higher. Nathaniel glanced down at his watch, maintaining his cold, clinical detachment. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He held it casually in his hand, waiting for the screaming match to reach its absolute peak. "The time for confessions is over," I said. My voice was quiet, but the absolute chilling authority in my tone immediately severed their chaotic arguing. Gavin stopped yelling. Melissa froze. Richard and Patricia turned their terrified, tear-streaked faces toward me. The silence slammed back into the room, heavy and suffocating. They looked at the manila envelope in Nathaniel's hand. They looked at the calm, merciless expression on my face. They finally understood that the trap had not just snapped shut. The walls were rapidly closing in to crush them. Nathaniel stepped forward and handed me the thick manila envelope. I did not open it delicately. I ripped the seal, pulled out a massive stack of heavily stapled legal documents, and threw them violently onto the nearest abandoned dining table. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood made my entire family flinch, as if a gunshot had gone off in the empty ballroom. "These are your options," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, terrified silence. "I am a very efficient CEO, so I have streamlined the process for you. There is no negotiation. There is no counter-offer. You have exactly 2 paths forward, and you are going to choose one of them right now." I stepped up to the table, tapping my index finger sharply against the top document. "Option 1, I said, staring directly at my mother. "Tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, Nathaniel submits the complete Apex Intelligence forensic audit and his official SEC investigative report directly to the Department of Justice. Federal arrest warrants will be issued by noon. Heavily armed federal marshals will kick down the front doors of your respective mansions. The 4 of you will be frog-marched out in handcuffs in front of local news cameras. You will be indicted for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy. Given the sheer scale of the theft and the fact that you targeted working-class pension funds, the federal judge will make an absolute example out of you. You will all receive mandatory minimum sentences of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary." Gavin let out a pathetic whimpering sound from the stage floor. Melissa covered her ears physically, trying to block out the horrifying reality of her impending future. Or I continued, letting my voice drop to a cold, razor-sharp whisper. "You choose option 2. You pick up a pen and you sign every single page of this document right now." Richard pushed himself away from Patricia, his eyes darting to the thick stack of papers. "What is it?" my father asked, his voice completely hollow. "What are you forcing us to sign?" "It is a comprehensive, legally binding confession of guilt and an absolute, irrevocable asset forfeiture agreement," I explained smoothly. "By signing this document, you are formally pleading guilty to the SEC charges and willfully surrendering every single asset you possess to the federal government to facilitate total restitution." I leaned over the table, ensuring they understood the absolute severity of my terms. "You are going to sell the sprawling estate. You are going to liquidate the luxury vehicles, the country club memberships, and the offshore investment portfolios. Patricia, you are going to empty your private jewelry safe. Melissa, you are going to hand over the keys to that custom Porsche you bought with my college tuition. Every single yacht, every piece of designer clothing, every single painting on your walls will be seized and auctioned. You are going to surrender every single dime to repay the $18 million you stole from those innocent people. We will be left with absolutely nothing!" Melissa shrieked, dropping her hands from her ears. She stumbled forward, her face twisted in pure, unadulterated panic. "You cannot take everything. We need somewhere to live. How are we supposed to survive? You will survive the exact same way I did when you threw me out on the street to pay for your luxury lifestyle," I fired back, silencing her instantly. "You will find a cheap, cramped apartment. You will ride the subway. You will scrub floors or flip burgers if you have to. I literally do not care if you have to dig through trash cans to eat. You are going to experience the exact same crushing poverty you mocked me for enduring." My father stepped forward, his legal instincts making one final, desperate, pathetic attempt to save his wealth. "This is blatant coercion, Rebecca," Richard yelled, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "This is extortion. No judge in the country will uphold a contract signed under this kind of aggressive duress. You are blackmailing us." Nathaniel let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a cold, terrifying sound. "You clearly do not understand how federal plea deals work," Richard, my husband, said, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. "This is not extortion. This is an officially sanctioned, highly regulated SEC deferred prosecution agreement. We are offering you a one-time, non-negotiable lifeline to avoid spending the rest of your miserable lives rotting in a federal cage. The Department of Justice will gladly accept your voluntary asset forfeiture in exchange for dropping the criminal indictments. It saves them the cost of a lengthy trial, and it ensures the victims are fully compensated immediately." Nathaniel leaned down, placing both his hands flat on the table, intimidating my father into stepping back. If you want to argue duress, Richard be my guest. Refuse to sign. Walk out those heavy wooden doors right now with your pride intact. I will personally have the arrest warrants expedited. You can test your brilliant legal theories in front of a federal judge while wearing an orange jumpsuit. Richard swallowed hard. His arrogant defiance completely evaporated. He looked at the heavy stack of papers, realizing there was absolutely no loophole, no hidden exit strategy. They were trapped in a flawless, inescapable legal vice. Patricia crawled across the stage, pushing herself to her feet with agonizing effort. She stumbled down the velvet stairs, looking like a broken, aged ghost of the powerful woman she had been just an hour ago. She approached the table, her hands shaking so violently she could barely keep them at her sides. "Rebecca, please," my mother begged. Her voice was a broken, raspy whisper. "We understand. We will pay back the $18 million. We will give them everything we stole. But our personal assets, the money we earned legitimately over 30 years of working, our savings accounts, you cannot take that too. We will be destitute. Just let us keep a fraction of it so we can start over. Just a few million, please. Have some mercy." I stared at the woman who had poured wine on me, who had gleefully commanded me to pay $45,000 to humiliate me, who had drained my college fund and told me it was a market crash. "Your legitimate assets total approximately $3 million, I stated with clinical precision. "And you are correct, Patricia. That money does not belong to the Vanguard pension funds." Hope flared briefly in my mother's tear-stained eyes. A desperate, pathetic glimmer of salvation. "But it does not belong to you either," I declared, crushing that hope instantly. "Because Clause Section 4 of this agreement mandates that every single dollar remaining after the restitution is paid will be irrevocably transferred into a newly established charitable trust." "What trust?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking. "An educational scholarship fund," I answered, an icy smile touching the corners of my mouth. "A massive, fully funded trust dedicated entirely to providing full-ride university scholarships for underprivileged low-income students who cannot afford their college tuition. You are going to spend the rest of your lives watching your precious hard-earned wealth pay for the education of thousands of strangers while you scrounge for pennies just to pay rent." Patricia let out a devastated, piercing wail. She collapsed into a nearby chair, burying her face in her arms as she sobbed uncontrollably. The ultimate punishment for her staggering greed was not just losing her money. It was being forced to give it all away to the very people she despised. Melissa fell to her knees beside the table, completely ruined. Gavin remained curled on the stage, rocking back and forth in a state of catatonic shock. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a sleek black pen. I tossed it onto the stack of legal documents. It clattered sharply against the table. "You have 60 seconds to pick up that pen and sign your names," I announced, checking the clock on my phone. "If the ink is not on the paper by the time I reach 0, Nathaniel makes the call to the Department of Justice." I looked at my broken, weeping family. 59, I started counting. 58. 57. I continued, my voice echoing like a metronome of doom. 56. Patricia lunged forward from her collapsed position on the floor. She crawled the remaining few feet and desperately grabbed the hem of my wine-stained dress. Her perfectly manicured hands, adorned with diamonds, bought with stolen money, clutched the cheap fabric like a drowning sailor holding a lifeline. "Rebecca, please!" my mother wailed. Her face was buried against my knees, soaking my dress with her tears. "I am your mother. I gave birth to you. We share the same blood. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. Please, I am begging you." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I did not step away. I did not pull my dress from her grasp. I simply stared at her with absolute, unwavering apathy. "Blood does not make you a mother, Patricia," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or mercy. "Blood just makes you a biological technicality. You stopped being my mother the day you stole my future to buy a sports car. You stopped being family the moment you poured wine on me tonight and laughed. 55, I counted, stepping backward and forcing her hands to slip off my dress. 54. Patricia collapsed onto her stomach, sobbing hysterically into the carpet. I looked down at her and delivered the absolute final verdict. This restaurant is for winners. You people go find another table. Richard broke. The brilliant, ruthless corporate lawyer finally recognized that he was entirely outmatched and out of time. He scrambled forward, his knees hitting the hardwood stage. He practically threw himself across the table and snatched the black pen. His hands were shaking violently. He flipped to the signature page of the massive legal document. He did not bother reading the fine print. He already knew exactly what it said. He was signing away his mansion, his cars, his offshore accounts, and his entire arrogant legacy. Richard pressed the pen to the paper. His signature, usually a bold, sweeping stroke of authority, was a jagged, pathetic scrawl. He signed the first page, then the second, then the third. "Sign it, Patricia." Richard hissed, grabbing his wife by the shoulder and hauling her upright. "Sign the papers right now, or we are going to die in federal prison." Patricia took the pen with trembling, numb fingers. She looked at the paper as if it were a death warrant. With a guttural, wretched sob, she signed her name officially, surrendering her entire empire to the charities she despised. Richard threw the pen at Gavin. The ruined fund manager snatched it up instantly. He scribbled his name across the corporate forfeiture lines, crying, openly terrified of Nathaniel's federal badge. Gavin shoved the pen into Melissa's chest. "Your turn." Gavin spat viciously. "Sign it." Melissa stared at the pen. She looked at the giant screen behind me, still displaying the frozen dead assets. She looked at the empty ballroom, the abandoned champagne flutes, the total destruction of her perfect golden life. Her hand shook so hard she dropped the pen twice before managing to grip it. She signed her name, weeping in absolute agonizing humiliation. The golden child was officially bankrupt. 50, I announced, stopping the countdown. Nathaniel stepped forward and smoothly collected the signed documents. He checked each signature with professional efficiency, ensuring every single line was properly executed. "We have a fully executed deferred prosecution and asset forfeiture agreement," Nathaniel confirmed, sliding the papers into his manila envelope. "The Department of Justice will begin the asset seizure protocols at dawn." Nathaniel then reached into his jacket pocket one final time. He pulled out a single crisp white envelope and dropped it onto the table right in front of Melissa. "What is that?" Melissa whispered, staring at the envelope as if it contained poison. "That is a formal notice of immediate disbarment from the New York State Bar Association," Nathaniel stated coldly. "My office forwarded them the undeniable proof of your involvement in international money laundering and wire fraud this afternoon. They held an emergency ethical review panel. As a condition of avoiding a federal indictment, your license to practice law has been permanently and irrevocably revoked. You will never set foot in a courtroom again." Melissa let out a raw, devastating scream. She buried her face in her hands, her entire identity, her career, her prestige completely annihilated in a single stroke. "You have exactly 24 hours to vacate your properties," I instructed my family, delivering my final unyielding orders. "Federal marshals will arrive at your Beacon Hill mansion and your luxury downtown condos tomorrow evening to change the locks. You are permitted to take one suitcase of basic clothing each. No jewelry, no watches, no electronics. Every single item of value belongs to the restitution trust." Richard stared at me, his eyes hollow and dead. "Where are we supposed to go?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We have no money. We have no homes." "That is entirely your problem," I answered smoothly. "But I highly suggest you pack your bags and leave the state of New York immediately. Your names are permanently toxic here. You are radioactive. No bank will ever hire you. No firm will ever represent you. No country club will ever let you pass the front gate. You are officially exiled." I turned my back on them. I did not wait for a response. I linked my arm through Nathaniel's, and together we walked down the velvet stairs of the stage. We walked down the wide center aisle of the grand ballroom. The few remaining wealthy guests who had lingered near the heavy wooden doors to watch the absolute destruction of the Vanguard dynasty parted ways immediately. They pressed themselves flat against the walls, creating a wide, respectful path for us. They looked at me with a mixture of profound fear and undeniable respect. I was no longer the shabby wine-stained outcast. I was the architect of the greatest financial execution they had ever witnessed. I did not look back at the stage. I did not need to see my mother sobbing on the floor, my father staring at his ruined hands, or my sister weeping over her revoked law license. They were ghosts to me now, permanently erased from my reality. We walked out through the heavy wooden doors of the Plaza Hotel, leaving the toxic, burning ruins of their empire far behind us. The cool, crisp night air of New York City hit my face. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of 33 years finally lift off my shoulders entirely. 6 months passed with the brutal efficiency of a perfectly executed corporate liquidation. The federal justice system and the unforgiving machinery of Wall Street did exactly what I knew they would. They ground my family into absolute, unrecognizable dust. I never actively sought out information about their whereabouts, but in the financial sector, gossip is a highly traded commodity. Through brief passing comments from industry contacts, the stark reality of their new existence painted a vivid picture of total ruin. The former regional director of Vanguard Trust, the woman who once spent $10,000 on a single pair of diamond earrings, now works the graveyard shift as a cashier at a rundown gas station in a bleak, forgotten suburb of New Jersey. Patricia wears a stiff neon polyester uniform that smells permanently of stale coffee and diesel fuel. Her hands, once perfectly manicured and dripping in stolen jewels, are now calloused and rough from wiping down dirty counters. She spends her brutal 8-hour shifts standing behind a thick sheet of bulletproof glass, scanning barcodes and counting crumpled dollar bills for impatient, rude customers who do not care about her past elite status. Her Beacon Hill mansion and her designer wardrobe were completely auctioned off by the federal government. She lives in a cramped, windowless studio apartment, relying on unpredictable public transportation to get to a minimum wage job that barely covers her basic groceries. The golden couple did not survive the catastrophic loss of their wealth. The intense, crushing pressure of absolute poverty and looming legal fees shattered Melissa and Gavin's marriage in a matter of weeks. Gavin filed for an incredibly messy, vicious divorce, desperately trying to shield whatever hidden pennies he had left from Melissa's massive civil liabilities. He failed spectacularly. He currently lives in a cheap, dingy motel near the airport, constantly dodging aggressive collection agencies and process servers who hound him day and night. Melissa suffered the most humiliating fall from grace. Stripped permanently of her prestigious law license, she is legally barred from stepping foot inside any corporate high-rise in Manhattan. The golden child who once proudly orchestrated multi-million-dollar offshore mergers now works as a low-level hourly filing clerk for a sleazy strip mall defense attorney in Queens. She spends her miserable days sorting through stacks of dusty, mundane paperwork, suffocating under the crushing weight of Gavin's leftover debt and her own massive legal restitution payments. Her custom Porsches and Hamptons weekend getaways have been replaced by delayed utility bills, cheap ramen noodles, and the constant terrifying threat of eviction. They were completely and systematically erased from high society. Their names are permanently blacklisted from every country club, every charity gala, and every exclusive restaurant in the city. If a former colleague spots them on the street, they immediately cross to the other side of the avenue to avoid eye contact. The wealthy friends who once enthusiastically toasted their success now use their spectacular downfall as a harsh cautionary tale over expensive dinners. They are absolute ghosts, invisible, isolated, and utterly powerless. While they fade into the miserable, isolated reality of their own making, my world has expanded beyond measure. I stand at the absolute edge of my empire, looking down at the city that once felt entirely out of reach. The executive suite of Apex Intelligence occupies the top 3 floors of a towering glass and steel skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan. The floor-to-ceiling, reinforced windows offer an unobstructed panoramic view of the financial district. Below me, the very same streets where I once scrubbed commercial office floors at 3 in the morning now pulse with the rhythm of an economy my firm helps police. I rest my hand against the cool, thick glass. Today I am not wearing a cheap off-the-rack dress bought on clearance to attend a toxic family event. I am wearing a bespoke midnight black power suit tailored to absolute perfection. The sharp, structured cut of the expensive fabric feels like an impenetrable suit of armor. The heavy, dark wine stain from my mother's crystal glass feels like a lifetime ago, completely washed away by the undeniable reality of what I have built. Beyond the glass walls of my private office, the massive operational floor of Apex Intelligence hums with terrifying calculated efficiency. Hundreds of the most brilliant forensic accountants, cybersecurity experts, and legal analysts in the country are hard at work. They monitor global markets, track illicit funds, and dismantle corrupt corporate empires with ruthless precision. They do not know about my dark childhood. They do not care that my father once called me a pathetic disappointment, or that my mother deliberately drained my college savings account. They respect me because I lead from the very front of the battlefield. I built this digital army from a cramped, unheated studio apartment operating on stale coffee and pure, unadulterated willpower. Every single person on that sprawling floor answers to me, not because I inherited a wealthy corporate legacy, but because I forged one out of absolute nothingness. The vicious power dynamics of my past have been completely eradicated. I no longer shrink into the shadows to avoid harsh criticism. I do not lower my voice to make arrogant people feel more comfortable. I own the entire building. The heavy oak door to my office opens with a soft, definitive click. I do not need to turn around to know who it is. The steady, familiar cadence of his footsteps against the polished hardwood floor grounds me instantly. Nathaniel walks into the spacious room, bringing with him the rich, comforting scent of roasted espresso. He is no longer wearing the simple gray suit that my family mocked so relentlessly at the Plaza Hotel. He wears the sharp, commanding attire befitting a senior lead investigator for the federal government. He walks across the office and gently places a steaming cup of coffee on my massive mahogany desk. He steps up directly behind me, wrapping his strong arms around my waist and pulling my back flush against his chest. He rests his chin on my shoulder, looking out at the exact same breathtaking view of the New York skyline. "We did good," Nathaniel murmurs quietly, his voice a low, steady rumble that completely chases away any lingering ghosts of my past. He presses a soft, lingering kiss to my temple. I lean back into his warm embrace, letting the absolute security of his presence wash over me. For so many years, I was aggressively conditioned to believe that love was a harsh transaction. I was taught that basic affection had to be earned by sacrificing my own dignity and bowing down to the toxic demands of greedy, manipulative people. My family viewed love as a weapon to be wielded, a tight leash designed to keep me entirely under their control. But Nathaniel showed me the truth. He stood beside me in the darkest, most humiliating corners of my life. He watched my mother pour wine on me, he watched my sister demand an outrageous financial ransom, and he never once hesitated to burn their entire fake kingdom to the ground just to protect me. I look at our reflection perfectly mirrored in the reinforced glass. The brilliant federal agent and the ruthless corporate chief executive. We are the ultimate apex predators of our respective worlds, but in this quiet room, we are just a husband and a wife who chose each other against all odds. I take a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute clarity of my new existence filling my lungs. The agonizing chapter of my life involving Patricia, Richard, Melissa, and Gavin is permanently and irrevocably closed. They are locked away in their self-made prisons of poverty and disgrace, completely powerless to ever reach me or harm me again. I finally understand the greatest, most profound lesson of my entire journey. Family is not determined by shared DNA. Biology is nothing but a random, meaningless genetic lottery. True family is not a heavy obligation you are simply born into. True family is forged in the deep trenches of your hardest battles. Family is the people who actively choose to stand between you and the blazing fire. Family is the people who draw a hard line in the sand and promise to protect you when you are at your absolute weakest. My father stood on a brightly lit stage and proudly declared to the entire world that I was nothing but a supporter. He thought calling me a follower was the ultimate inescapable insult. He truly believed he had the permanent patriarchal authority to dictate the rigid boundaries of my life. He was catastrophically wrong. I pick up the warm cup of coffee, letting the bitter, rich taste ground me entirely in the present moment. I am no longer the family scapegoat. I am no longer the quiet punching bag for a dynasty of narcissistic abusers. I am no longer a minor, insignificant supporting character trapped in the background of someone else's arrogant story. I turn away from the tall windows looking out over my sprawling, multi-million-dollar corporation. I am the sole architect of my own destiny. I am the one who writes the rules, and I am the one who executes the final judgment. A slow, genuine smile spreads across my face. It is not a polite smile of forced submission or fearful compliance. It is a smile of pure, undeniable power. It is the smile of a woman who was buried alive by her own blood, only to dig her way out and buy the entire graveyard. I am completely, utterly, and finally free. The story of Rebecca serves as a powerful exploration of toxic family dynamics and the myth of biological loyalty. The most profound lesson to extract from her journey is undeniable: your worth is never defined by the people who refuse to see it. You are the sole architect of your own destiny. For over 3 decades, Rebecca's family projected their superficial values onto her. They equated her refusal to participate in their corrupt, status-obsessed world with weakness and absolute failure. While I, as an AI, do not experience human emotions, the psychological patterns displayed in this narrative are heavily documented in human behavior. Toxic individuals frequently diminish those around them to maintain their own fragile sense of superiority. Patricia and Richard did not break their daughter. They merely exposed their own profound moral bankruptcy and cowardice. The true triumph in this story is not just the dramatic financial takedown of a corrupt corporate empire, it is Rebecca's unwavering self-reliance. Instead of internalizing her family's cruel narrative, she channeled her struggles into building something remarkable from the ground up. She demonstrated that real power comes from integrity, relentless hard work, and choosing a found family who will firmly stand between you and the fire. Her ultimate victory was not the moment she froze their offshore assets, but the moment she stopped seeking validation from her abusers. Ultimately, this narrative reminds us that we are never bound by the detrimental roles assigned to us by dysfunctional environments. We possess the autonomy to sever toxic ties, rewrite the rules, and forge a reality built on mutual respect. Evaluate the boundaries you have set in your own life today, and actively choose to invest your energy only in those who protect and celebrate your true worth.